Here is a captivating account of a series of extraordinary moments captured during World War II, providing a vivid glimpse into the realities faced by those involved. The footage in question showcases two of our military aircrafts, offering a rare and compelling visual record of wartime aviation. The material that you are about to see is a remarkable collection of color films dating from the era of the Second World War, filmed or edited by an individual named Jack Lieb just before and during the historic D-Day invasion. This footage stands apart from most war documentaries because it presents a perspective that is both personal and intimate, giving viewers an unprecedented look into the events as they unfolded. Using his own 16mm Kodak chrome camera, Lieb managed to produce images that are unlike the typical black and white footage common during that period. His innovative approach allowed for a more vivid and immediate experience, bringing the viewer right into the heart of the conflict. The journey captured in these films begins with the tense preparations for D-Day along the southern coast of England, continues through the victorious liberation of Paris, and ultimately extends into the heart of Germany itself. Along this route, Lieb also took the opportunity to document the everyday lives of ordinary people in France, a humanizing touch that reveals the impact of war on everyday citizens. Interspersed within these scenes are rare glimpses of notable personalities such as Ernest Hemingway, adding a layer of historical interest to the footage. One particularly fascinating aspect of this collection involves footage shot automatically within fighter planes. These cameras were installed to serve a critical purpose. After a pilot engaged in combat, especially if he claimed to have shot down an enemy aircraft, his victory could only be officially recognized if photographic evidence was available. To accomplish this, special automatic cameras, designed to operate in sync with the aircraft's machine guns, were used. When a plane was hit or claimed an enemy kill, the cameras would record the gunfire and the target, providing indisputable proof to military authorities. If you observe these shots carefully, you might even notice a remarkable moment where a pilot appears to leap out of his aircraft in mid-flight, an astonishing feat caught on film. These planes often carried supplementary fuel tanks mounted beneath their wings, which were crucial for extended missions, but also posed considerable danger. When bullets struck one of these tanks, the resulting explosion frequently led to the destruction of the aircraft. The footage includes many scenes that attest to this peril. When you see an explosion or wreckage, it's a clear indication that the pilot did not return from the mission. The formidable firepower of the aircraft's guns generated significant shockwaves, intense concussions that made it extremely difficult for the photographers to handle handheld cameras for extended periods. Despite these challenges, the footage remarkably captures the chaos and bravery inherent in aerial combat. One of the earliest actions undertaken by the American forces was the construction of an airstrip near St. Mary Glee, not far from the coastline. This strip was supported by a network of metal wires and supports designed to prevent the planes from sinking into the soft ground during takeoff and landing. It served as a critical launching pad for various operations. Notably, it was used for aircraft armed with 500-pound bombs under each wing, intended for deep strikes behind enemy lines. However, the makeshift and rough nature of this airstrip often led to mishaps. The bombs, due to the uneven terrain, sometimes broke loose during takeoff, despite being armed with fuses. When this occurred, the bombs had to be disarmed quickly and removed from the runway, a process fraught with danger and logistical difficulty. Among the aircraft seen in these scenes are the renowned P-47 Thunderbolts, iconic fighters of the war. One of these planes was loaded with a bomb under each wing, ready for daring missions deep into enemy territory, targeting formidable defenses and supply lines. The footage captures moments as two planes take off simultaneously from the short and rugged strip, raising large amounts of dust in the process, yet managing to lift off against all odds. One detail that catches the eye is the buckle seen beneath the wheels of one aircraft. Such a buckle could sometimes cause issues with the support wires of the runway, leading to structural failures. On a particular occasion, this malfunction caused the wire mesh to snap and strike the aircraft's propeller, resulting in a tragic crash before the plane had even managed to leave the ground. My personal interest in the war grew during my first visit to London, especially when I saw the historic Houses of Parliament and the towering clock of Big Ben. It's worth remembering that these photographs and footage are over 25 years old, capturing a period long past, but still vividly alive in memory. During that time, a source of amusement and entertainment for the American troops stationed throughout England was a visit to Westminster Abbey, a place rich in history and grandeur. Many soldiers from the United States traveled across the Atlantic to behold these historic sites and experience the cultural heritage of Britain firsthand. One of the scenes I was particularly eager to photograph was recorded on a quiet Sunday afternoon at Westminster Abbey, a site that symbolized centuries of history and solemnity. Additionally, I found myself intrigued by Marble Arch, a prominent monument in London that, on that same peaceful Sunday, was filled with numerous visitors. It is important to keep in mind that during this period, London was subject to nightly bombing raids, which added a layer of tension and danger to ordinary life. Despite the constant threat of air raids, life in the city persisted, and these moments of crowd-filled tranquility offered poignant contrasts to the chaos of war. During my reporting assignments, I found myself documenting a series of scenes that vividly depicted life amidst the chaos and anticipation of the approaching invasion. One of the moments that sticks in my memory is capturing images of various speakers addressing large crowds. Each individual conveyed a different message, yet an interesting calm prevailed. Police officers lingered around, observing quietly, simply making sure that no serious disputes or heated arguments erupted. As long as tempers remained under control and no violence ensued, these law enforcement personnel did little more than stand watch. Meanwhile, people in the audience occasionally exchanged words with the speakers, engaging in spirited discussions that typified the atmosphere of these gatherings. Most of these photographs serve as unvarnished depictions of how society occupied itself during the long days waiting for D-Day. In those times, a significant number of children residing in England, or at least a large proportion of them, had been evacuated from the cities to escape the chaos of war, seeking safety in the countryside. Yet, despite the ongoing conflict, many children who stayed behind in London still managed to find ways to entertain themselves, refusing to be entirely subdued by the circumstances. To my surprise, I observed young ones drinking from communal cups that were connected to water fountains, an example of the resourcefulness people employed to maintain some semblance of normalcy. I tried to quietly photograph these children without drawing their attention, hoping to catch candid moments of innocence and resilience. However, they occasionally noticed me. One particular boy was captured enjoying a refreshing drink on a bright Sunday afternoon, embodying a sense of youthful ease amid the uncertainty. Our exploration revealed that even iconic landmarks like St. Paul's Cathedral had sustained some damage, being hit several times, though thankfully they were not severely damaged. An even more prominent site was Buckingham Palace and its gates, which were now under the protection of British soldiers. Unlike the usual formations in peaceful times, these troops were dressed in full war uniforms, patrolling up and down the streets as part of their essential duty rather than performing for the camera. Behind them, barrage balloons dotted the London skyline, floating overhead in strategic formations. It was said that these balloons played a crucial role in the city's defenses, preventing invading aircraft from gaining a clear shot at key targets. Moreover, some believed that without the barrage balloons and the extensive defensive systems they supported, the city's fragile infrastructure might have been overwhelmed and the islands might have been engulfed by the sea. Food supplies in London, as I experienced, were also quite limited, and everything had to be brought in by various means and quickly unloaded. Despite these hardships, the incredible resilience of the people stood out, especially on days when the spring skies cooperated, providing clear and sunny weather, which was a rare luxury in London during wartime. These moments offered a unique opportunity to document what the soldiers and civilians were doing while waiting for the signal to launch the invasion. My journey then took me to Fleet Street, an iconic area steeped in history. There, I encountered an Irish policeman tasked with guarding the street, and the scene showed signs of the destruction caused by the ongoing war. Soon afterward, we moved southward along England's coast, where I joined other news correspondents who would soon cross the English Channel with us. Many of these seasoned journalists had chronicled past conflicts and bore familiar faces to those who followed war reporting. Among our group was Larry Lossauer from CBS, who was covering the entire campaign for the network. To my left was Wharton Becker, also from CBS, alongside Jack Thompson representing the Chicago Tri-Weekly Tribune, and Ernie Pyle, whose renowned reports had made him well known among war correspondents. A close-up photograph shows Jack Thompson, and another depicts Larry O'Reilly from the Associated Press, all preparing to depart. It was clear we had a long journey ahead as we exchanged farewells, knowing we would most likely meet again in Paris. On my left, I also noticed Clark Lee from INS and Bill Stoneman, who had come from Chicago, working for the Daily News. Our group was being loaded onto a military truck that would convey us further along the coast. On the way, we passed through small British towns where life was continuing in a manner remarkably unaffected by the war. People going about their daily routines, undeterred by the looming danger. These scenes offered a stark contrast to what awaited us across the channel, but they served as a reminder that life, in some form, persists even in the shadow of conflict. The locals were going about their daily routines in the marketplace, seemingly unconcerned by the tense situation unfolding around them. They were busy buying food and goods, appearing completely indifferent to the larger events taking place just beyond their viewing horizon. Meanwhile, after traveling approximately 150 miles in an army vehicle, that's exactly how we felt, exhausted but alert, as if the journey itself mirrored the heavy anticipation we carried. Upon arrival, we observed that Plymouth had been struck by extensive destruction. Many of its buildings lay in ruins, shattered by the chaos that had swept through the area. Unfortunately, such devastation was not isolated but widespread across the entire region, a grim reminder of the violence that had recently transpired. As we continued our approach, we soon reached the port area, where we encountered rows of American jeeps poised and ready to be loaded onto landing craft. These humble vehicles, equipped with special bars attached to their bumpers, caught our eye. These bars were purposefully designed to act as wire cutters, a critical feature considering the Germans had a habit of stretching barbed wire across roads, often with deadly consequences. These wire barriers could easily decapitate unwary drivers caught in their path, making the Jeep's robust bumpers with wire-cutting attachments an essential part of military caution. Security measures were tight. We were prohibited from wandering freely around the vicinity. Each intersection and crossroads was under vigilant guard, with both American and British soldiers patrolling and monitoring activity. If anyone wanted to inspect what was stored in your bedding or possessions, they had the authority to demand a look, a clear indication of how carefully guarded the operations had to be to maintain the secrecy of the upcoming invasion. It was evident that preserving such confidentiality was of the utmost importance. No detail could be left unguarded. Among the personnel present were two men, Wes Carroll of the Office of Information and Pete Carroll, who was a photographer with the Associated Press. Also present was Wes Haynes, a companion during this journey. We all boarded an LCI, numbered 5, a landing craft infantry vessel designed to carry troops and equipment directly to the beaches. Pete Carroll, who hailed from Boston, brought along his camera, intent on capturing images from the moment. Despite the tense atmosphere, we tried to divert our minds, aware that what lay ahead would happen shortly. We sampled the local provisions, including a taste of biscuits and rations known as crations, which surprisingly weren't so bad, especially when hunger was a factor. That area's scenery was also striking. Rolling, lush countryside visible from our vantage point, a peaceful contrast to the chaos that was soon to unfold. These scenes, I mused, would serve as mementos to share with my family and friends, offering a glimpse of the tranquil landscape just before the storm. Pete Carroll took some of his film to make a few shots of the surroundings, aiming to document the moment for historical memory. Before long, we arrived at the docks where units of the 101st Airborne Division were bustling, carrying everything they could by hand, readying for the assault. They boarded landing craft that were so heavily loaded they had to be pushed into the water by trucks, a logistical feat highlighting the urgency and scale of the operation. For the invasion, these troops were being ferried out to larger ships, each man and each piece of equipment vital to the upcoming fight. Among their gear, many carried grenades and bazookas, though they had little chance to load these onto jeeps at this stage, as vehicles were limited and not yet fully prepared for the operation. We watched as these units moved with purpose, their determination evident as they prepared for the assault. Our own vessel was part of a fleet of LCIs, and alongside us stood the commander of the invasion group, a stern and capable officer. The captain of our ship was Lieutenant Patton, a man with notable experience, having participated in several invasions across the Mediterranean. His presence provided a degree of confidence. We knew that he was well-versed in these operations and trusted his command. We learned that Lieutenant Patton was no stranger to combat. His previous involvements in wartime campaigns gave us reassurance that he knew what was necessary to lead his men effectively. Our stay aboard the ship lasted nearly 5 days, during which we remained in close quarters with these seasoned officers and crews. The squadron commander, a towering figure whose name I remember well, Lieutenant Patton, was in charge of the entire operation, and his leadership was evident in the disciplined manner in which everything was managed. Wes Haynes, meanwhile, was already trying to prepare himself mentally for the upcoming trip into Paris, although some might say he was perhaps rushing his preparations too early. Meanwhile, the troops of the 101st Airborne Division aboard our landing craft were idling and amusing themselves during the wait, trying to keep spirits high amid the tension. Among them was a man who served as an impersonator, mimicking a well-known figure. This individual, a former Notre Dame football player, was later reported to have been killed in action, underscoring the peril that these men faced every day in this vital and dangerous operation. Certainly, here's a deeply reworked and expanded version of the provided text, rendered in fluent, literary English, with appropriate detail and smooth transitions, approximately 50 to 100% longer than the original. Every naval vessel, no matter its size or purpose, was often associated with a distinctive mascot or emblem, serving as a symbol of pride and camaraderie for the crew. Our ship was no exception. However, rather than simply assigning a mascot for tradition's sake, the crew took practical measures to ensure its well-being. They crafted a small life preserver, designed in the same style as the ones the sailors themselves wore, as a protective and caring gesture toward their chosen emblem. This act reflected not only their resourcefulness, but also their sense of responsibility and unity. One particular afternoon, a sense of anticipation swept through the crew. Lieutenant Patton gathered everyone on deck and addressed the assembled men, calmly announcing that we would be setting sail that very day. His words were met with an immediate and collective reaction. A cheer erupted across the ship. Such a response was natural because this was the mission everyone had been anxiously awaiting. All hands were eager to see the completion of their task so they could return home, waiting patiently for the moment when they could say they had participated in an important operation. As the ship moved out into the channel, we were able to observe an awe-inspiring sight. The scene stretched from one horizon to the other, ships of all kinds and sizes, creating a vast flotilla that stretched endlessly into the distance. It was said that there were more than 1,000 vessels participating in this convoy, a testament to the scale and significance of the operation. Despite the impressive display, many of us still regarded this moment as just another scheduled exercise. Confidence lingered that we might be called back, turned around, or reassigned before reaching our destination, with hopes to attempt the landing on another day. However, as the hours passed and darkness fell, a growing realization settled over us. This was no practice. We understood firmly that we were participating in a real, live campaign. The situation became even more tense when a brief scare arose. Rumors circulated about the presence of a submarine lurking nearby. In response, one of the destroyer escorts, a DE boat, dropped a few depth charges into the channel, which produced loud explosions. Despite the commotion, we saw no indication of an attack, and anxiety gradually subsided. Most of us remained on high alert, prepared for any sudden threat or engagement. Then, scenes unfolded near the beach itself, captured affordably and efficiently by film cameras. These shots showed the ships making a sharp right-angle turn as they headed toward the designated landing area. In the distance, a destroyer escort could be seen moving forward in readiness. We maintained constant vigilance against any prospective attack, especially during these critical moments. Fortunately, our Air Force performed admirably throughout the operation, providing crucial support from above. I personally was unaware of any enemy attack during the landing procedure, until, after we had touched down, 2 German planes attempted to strafe the shoreline. I happened to be nearby at that moment, witnessing their sudden and dangerous assault. Along with these scenes captured on film, shot with a 16mm camera that I had with me, are shots taken from a different perspective. One notable sequence was taken from an automatic camera mounted on a British landing craft, which was designed to record the first men to reach the beaches. These were the brave troops who had the task of planting their feet on enemy territory amidst uncertainty and danger. The reason for using an automatic device was to ensure that a permanent record of the landing was preserved, especially in case the operation failed. If the landing had gone awry, this footage could provide critical insights on what went wrong and how to improve subsequent attempts. Here, you can see the actual process of disembarkation on Utah Beach. The men descended from the landing craft in a slow, deliberate manner, rather than rushing ashore in haste. They moved cautiously and steadily, fully aware of the deadly threats around them: hidden bombs, landmines sewn into the terrain, and the ever-present danger of enemy fire. Notice that many soldiers had their rifles wrapped in transparent cellophane, a simple yet effective precaution against the salty, damp air that could compromise their equipment. Such careful, measured movements were necessary because danger lurked in every corner, and every step forward could be fraught with peril. It's impossible not to acknowledge the grim reality faced by many of those brave men. While some made it safely ashore, not everyone was so fortunate. Among those who carried equipment with determination, I can recall Pete Carroll and Wes Haynes, each supporting gear for the others as they moved forward. The ship itself was later grounded on the difficult terrain near the beach, obstructed in its progress. The section of the shoreline we found ourselves on was under enemy fire, which added a further layer of complexity and danger to our mission. In one of the preceding photographs, a bomb had landed surprisingly close by, highlighting the constant threat from above. The explosion ringed by the blast was a stark reminder of the fierce combat happening just beyond reach. Meanwhile, bulldozers and engineers worked rapidly to clear pathways, attempting to carve roads through the wreckage and debris so that jeeps and tanks could advance and support the troops on the ground. Despite the fact that it was still June, a time typically associated with warmer weather, the climate in Normandy was noticeably cold and harsh. The chill in the air was characteristic for that region at that time of year, lending an extra element of difficulty to an already arduous battle. Every detail and scene reflected the intense, dangerous reality faced by those who fought and endured during that historic landing, an operation marked by courage, sacrifice, and an unwavering determination amid chaos and peril. This version elaborates on the original ideas, adds descriptive details for clarity, and ensures a smooth, polished narrative suitable for a compelling storytelling format. Certainly, here's a deeply rephrased, expanded, and polished version of the original text in English, following the guidelines you provided. Naturally, the soldiers hurriedly dug their foxholes a little deeper in an effort to secure a safer position amid the chaos of battle. Fortunately, luck was on our side, and we managed to discover a sturdy concrete wall nearby, which provided additional protection against enemy fire and the elements. Even at this point, we were engaged in the difficult task of evacuating our wounded soldiers from the front line back to the safety of the beach, with the hope of eventually transporting them across the Atlantic to England. When the tide receded, the ships that had come to land at the beach faced a significant obstacle. They could not approach too close because of the shifting sands and dangerous shallows. Ships that ran aground had to wait patiently until the next high tide, when the rising waters could refloat them, provided they weren't severely damaged during their landing. During that initial night, we remained on the beach, making our shelter in a makeshift foxhole and trying to find some semblance of safety amidst the unsettling sounds of war. Before long, we were able to bring in some of the first prisoners captured in this particular sector, mostly individuals apprehended near the shoreline late on the very first day of combat. Due to the limited space available in England, these prisoners were swiftly sent back across the ocean, as there simply wasn't room to hold them permanently in Britain at that moment. This location served as our first command post, where General Collins was seen, on the left in the photograph, engaging in discussions with some of his officers. It was also the place where we finally managed to obtain some of the earliest hot meals we'd had since landing, an invaluable comfort after days of rationed cold food. I recall being struck by how ravenously hungry I felt upon seeing those pictures later, recognizing now how much those meals eased our suffering. Close by, you can spot Larry Lossauer once more, along with Bob Landry, sitting on the right side of the shot. Bob Landry was there representing the war correspondents from Time and Life magazines, capturing the unfolding events through his camera lens. Despite being extremely busy for a solid 8 days, firing the camera nonstop, I eventually ran out of film. As a result, I made the decision to leave for France again, both to acquire fresh film stock and perhaps to take a much-needed bath. For the entire duration of the landing and subsequent days, I had not taken off my gear or even removed my clothes, so the thought of bathing became increasingly appealing. My arrival in England was at a seaside town near Bournemouth. The coastline there bore a striking resemblance to the famous cliffs of Dover, familiar to many, with their breathtaking white chalk faces and rugged beauty. It was truly a magnificent view to be greeted by the sight of the English coast, and I found a strange comfort in knowing that rest and recovery were finally within reach after the exhausting days behind us. However, I was unaware at the time that the relentless buzz bombs, V-1 flying bombs, would soon begin flying over the English skies. These weapons, infamous for their terrifying unpredictability, would become a sinister menace, their paths often difficult to predict. Some of these buzz bombs can be seen soaring above the coastline in the photographs, their dark shapes streaking across the sky. They represented a new kind of terror, an unpredictable weapon whose fall locations could cause vast destruction, yet the British military responded swiftly. They set up rapid-fire machine guns and anti-aircraft artillery to shoot them down whenever possible, managing to bring down quite a few before they could reach their intended targets. Despite their efforts, some of these deadly projectiles managed to evade the defenses, and when they did land, the damage was often catastrophic. There are instances, as captured on film, where one of these bombs was seen descending, finally reaching the ground in the London area and causing considerable destruction in its wake. It was clear that despite the valiant attempts of the British defenders, a certain number of these weapons would always get through, leaving behind destruction and tragedy. My second crossing of the English Channel took place aboard an LST, the landing ship, tank, this time accompanying units from the 3rd Armored Division. Their presence was critically needed, as they brought with them additional tanks and vehicles essential for our advance. The convoy was massive, strongly indicating the importance of the mission, and heavily loaded with equipment and supplies vital for our progress. The ship was operated by a crew from Britain, evidenced by the captain dressed in a British naval uniform, overseeing operations from the bridge. We traveled in a long convoy of similar vessels, all waiting to set course for the same destination. The ships were filled to capacity with weapons, ammunition, and other necessary gear, carefully stowed to ensure they wouldn't be damaged during transit. This scene gives a good impression of what the beachhead looked like on that day. Ships lined up as they patiently awaited the tide's ebb and flow. Their strategic positioning was crucial. They waited for the right moment when the waters would recede enough so that they could unload their cargo safely, without risking the ships running aground or being damaged by the rough waters. Unlike the circumstances on D-Day, when ships had to navigate through deeper, more treacherous waters, at this stage, they were anchored in shallows, carefully awaiting the next favorable tide. A temporary storm had struck the area earlier, knocking out the ramps used for unloading, which further delayed the arrival of supplies and personnel ashore. Once the weather cleared and the ramps were repaired, the ships could finally proceed, unloading their vital payload and supporting the ongoing campaign. This patience and meticulous planning were essential to ensure that the invasion forces could move ashore safely and efficiently, marking an important phase of the larger operation. This expanded version aims to provide more detailed descriptions, easy transitions, and a clear narrative flow, fulfilling all your specified requirements. During the course of the operation, it became increasingly evident what difficulties the troops encountered on D-Day. When the landing craft made contact with the sandbars along the coast, the soldiers on board initially thought they had reached shallow water. However, as they advanced ashore, they soon realized the water was deeper ahead. This misjudgment caused many to struggle as they waded into the sea, and those soldiers who had their life preservers positioned too loosely around their waists found themselves turning upside down, their efforts to remain afloat futile, resulting in a significant number drowning in the tumultuous waters. Meanwhile, units of the Third Army were approaching from behind, crossing over the deeper stretches of water just ahead of these landing parties, with their sights set directly on Cherbourg itself. The sight that unfolded was nothing short of remarkable. Ships stretched out as far as the eye could see, lining up in endless rows, continuously bringing vital supplies ashore to sustain the advancing forces. The strategic importance of capturing Cherbourg was immense, as it was envisioned as a potential port that could be utilized to facilitate further logistical operations. However, reality proved to be harsher than anticipated. Upon arrival, it was clear that Cherbourg had suffered severe damage at the hands of the Germans. The enemy forces had systematically destroyed the docks, rendering them unusable, which posed a major obstacle for the Allied supply efforts. I recall that it took nearly 2 months before the first ship managed to anchor in the harbor again, after meticulous efforts to clear the mines the Germans had laid and to repair the infrastructure. The Germans had also sabotaged the inland waterways and bridges connected to Cherbourg, including some of the major canals, which further hampered movement and supply routes. One such canal, heavily damaged, exemplified the extent of German destruction and strategic sabotage efforts. As the fighting drew to a close, the liberated French residents gradually returned to Cherbourg, greeting the returning soldiers with warm hospitality and heartfelt welcome. Among the priorities was the collection of prisoners, roughly 16,000 to 18,000 men, who had been gathered in the Cherbourg area during the fighting. These prisoners were being herded toward the beaches, where they awaited transfer to England and eventually to the United States, to be held in prisoner-of-war camps. Even at that early stage, reports from the captured soldiers indicated a grim outlook. Many believed that within a week, the Germans would force a retreat, pushing the Allied forces back into the Channel. In the headquarters zones, it was common to find German propaganda posters, including a picture of Adolf Hitler, often used by our soldiers as makeshift pinboards, pinning notes and reminders on the image. Despite the hardships faced, the soldiers found ways to keep their spirits alive through humor and camaraderie. One of the significant moments during this period was the first official ceremony held in France. During this event, General Collins, positioned on the right, presented a tattered flag made from parachute cloth, commonly called the tricolor, shown here to the mayor of Cherbourg, who was speaking into a microphone. This was a proud moment for all involved, and the soldiers of the 7th Corps were dressed in freshly issued, clean uniforms to mark the occasion. As the fighting subsided, local residents who had survived the clashes began to visit and talk with the returning troops, expressing their gratitude and sharing their experiences. In photographs, we see Ernie Pyle at the center, conversing with a colonel from the Signal Corps. Also present is Bert Brandt, whom we had seen earlier, capturing images for the Associated Press, along with Seal Kay and John McGlindsey, each contributing to documenting these historic moments. Later, the front line shifted as the troops moved in the opposite direction, preparing to attack enemy positions along the Saint-Lô line. During this movement, the units passed through the city of Vlayun, which had been completely destroyed by the relentless fighting. I have visited Vlayun several times since the war ended, and I can attest that the city has since been reconstructed beautifully, standing as a testament to resilience and rebuilding efforts. The Germans, in their desperate attempts to hold ground, tried to make a stand in various locations. Wherever they chose to resist fiercely, our forces had to press on, pushing them back with force. Unfortunately, this often resulted in the destruction of those areas, including entire towns and cities. In later years, I had the opportunity to see firsthand the remnants of construction works carried out by forced laborers during the occupation, an unsettling reminder of the darker aspects of the conflict. Throughout the entire coastline, especially in the region of Normandy as well as other surrounding areas, extensive defensive constructions were put in place, notably these triangular-shaped structures. Many of these were equipped with minas attached to them, designed as deadly traps. If a boat inadvertently brushed against or touched one of these triangles, the mines would be triggered to explode. After taking a walk along this stretch of beach, I was advised to exercise extreme caution and to avoid stepping onto any ground that appeared soft or unstable, as it could conceal hidden dangers such as mines or unexploded ordnance. One particular site I visited was a church located in Baffler, a charming little town that the German forces evacuated. The reason for their withdrawal was quite interesting. The German commander held a deep fondness for this small town and did not wish to see it razed or destroyed. Instead of engaging in a fierce fight over it, he chose to strategically retreat, preserving the town rather than risking its complete devastation. Baffler was originally a quiet fishing village, and I was fortunate enough to return multiple times because the local hotel remained largely untouched by the destruction, continuing to serve excellent French cuisine that delighted my senses. Further along the coast, we encountered formidable fortifications built under harsh conditions by forced labor, including slaves. These defensive structures were incredibly reinforced, with heavy metal fences installed to prevent any landing by enemy ships or infantry in that area. The anti-landing defenses included thick concrete walls, many feet in thickness, which spoke to the intense preparations made for an anticipated invasion. Some of these fortifications were so heavily constructed that they attracted the scrutiny of our field correspondents, who closely examined them for strategic insights. Interestingly, the Germans recognized the threat these defenses represented, and in several instances, they deliberately destroyed them by blowing up tunnels and walls so that the Allies could not seize or use them should they attempt to reclaim the territory. This destruction extended even to their own weapons, which they often dismantled or set to explode to deny the enemy any advantage. Despite the destruction in some parts, the remaining walls and defensive structures were remarkably robust, indicating the Germans' desire to make these defenses as durable and impregnable as possible. Eventually, the area was captured by the Navy, and an observation post was established at the very end of the promontory. This observation point was situated near a town called Granville, which sat at a strategic point that separated Normandy from Brittany. The Germans had utilized a lighthouse located at this headland as their vantage point, and it had come under the control of our naval officers, who used it to monitor enemy movements and gather intelligence, serving as a crucial observation post for our forces. Soon after, large armament units, including powerful artillery pieces, were brought in and set up in a nearby field. These guns were used to fire upon German positions further inland, making a significant impact on the battlefield. Despite the loud and thunderous reports of the artillery firing, I was struck by how the local French population continued their daily routines as if nothing unusual was happening. They went about bringing in crops, tending to their fields, and carrying out their usual activities with extraordinary calm. I was genuinely surprised by this resilience, and I felt compelled to capture that scene photographically. The immense recoil and earthquake-like tremors caused by the heavy artillery made it quite challenging to hold a camera steadily in hand for long periods, but I managed to take a few shots. One of the first strategic moves made by the American forces was the construction of an airstrip in the vicinity of St. Mary Glee, close to the coast. The strip was supported by a network of metal wire embedded in the ground, designed to prevent aircraft from sinking into soft soil during takeoff and landing. This airfield became a vital hub for our aerial operations, serving as a launch point for aircraft carrying 1,500-pound bombs under each wing, allowing for deep strikes behind enemy lines. The strip itself was quite rough and uneven, which often caused issues. Bombs loaded onto planes would sometimes break loose from their attachments, even though they were armed with explosive charges, requiring team efforts to disarm and remove them from the runway before continuing operation. The aircraft we relied on in this area were primarily P-47 Thunderbolts, known for their robustness and firepower. One particularly memorable sight was a P-47 carrying a bomb payload under each wing, poised to attack German positions deep within their territory. The takeoff process was quite dramatic. Two of these planes would often lift off almost simultaneously, kicking up considerable dust and debris as they rapidly gained altitude on the limited, makeshift runway. I also noticed a specific issue with some of the planes during takeoff: a buckle that sometimes appeared under the landing wheels. This buckle could cause a segment of mesh wire embedded in the ground to break away unexpectedly, striking the propeller of the aircraft. Such incidents occasionally resulted in crashes, preventing the plane from successfully taking off and forcing crews to disarm and detach the compromised bombs before they could cause further damage. Let me share with you an account of an unfortunate incident that occurred during our wartime reportage. It involves two of our fighter aircraft and illustrates the dangers faced even during the most routine missions. In this account, you will see some photographs taken automatically by cameras mounted on the planes. These cameras were installed to serve a specific purpose. Whenever a pilot claimed to have shot down an enemy aircraft, his assertion could only be confirmed by photographic evidence. Without such proof, no credit would be awarded for the kill. These cameras were synchronized with the fighter's gunfire. They would activate automatically in tandem with the firing of the machine guns, capturing the action on film. If you examine these photographs carefully, you'll notice the pilot appears to leap out of his cockpit in the moment the photo was snapped, a vivid reminder of the chaos of combat. You will also observe that many of these aircraft still carried the extra fuel tanks mounted beneath their wings, additions used to extend their operational range. Unfortunately, these tanks posed a significant hazard. When hit by enemy fire, they would often explode violently, bringing down the aircraft as you can see in the photographs. Such images serve as stark evidence that, in many cases, the pilot never survived the engagement. One of the most memorable parts of our journey through France was our visit to Mont Saint-Michel. The abbey, perched atop a rocky islet, was situated along a river that marked the border between Normandy and Brittany. During our stay there, we had the opportunity to meet some of our fellow correspondents. Among them was Bob Capper from Time magazine. Many in the audience may know of him. Tragically, Bob Capper was later killed while covering the conflict in Indochina, where the French were fighting in Southeast Asia. At Mont Saint-Michel, we discovered the Poulade Hotel, run by Madame Poulade herself. We were drawn to this modest establishment not only because it offered comfortable accommodations, but also because Madame Poulade was renowned for her delicious omelets, which became her signature dish. She became a memorable figure, and the hotel, with its charming surroundings, served as a popular gathering point for journalists and reporters. Many of us chose to gather at this location because it placed us closer to the fighting front than our main military bases, giving us a better vantage point for news gathering. Behind us stretched the winding river that separated Normandy from Brittany, and nearby was a tiny island with a well-preserved monastery at its summit, which remained untouched by the destruction of war. During our explorations, some of our soldiers, or GIs, were shown around by a local woman who acted as their guide, admiring the well-maintained structure and absorbing the historical atmosphere. Throughout the trip, we also reconnected with some of our fellow correspondents. For example, here is Charles Collingwood, distinguished among other esteemed journalists, along with Helen Kirkpatrick of the Chicago Daily News, and Joe Ling, a talented writer for the New Yorker magazine, recognizable by his bald head. On the left is Warden Becker. Ling was renowned for his compelling stories in the New Yorker. Sadly, he passed away not many years after these events. Then there was Ernest Hemingway, the famous author who was working as a war correspondent for Collier's magazine. We encountered him at Mont Saint-Michel, engaged in conversation with Bill Walton, who incidentally became a close friend of President John F. Kennedy. These moments allowed us a brief respite from the relentless pace of war reporting. Of course, during such times, we captured photographs to bring home, a small consolation and a means of sharing our experiences with family and friends. Among the people we encountered was Helen Kirkpatrick, and in the center of this particular photograph stands Bill Stringer, one of our brave colleagues. Sadly, Bill was killed while attempting to reach Paris ahead of others, a common ambition among correspondents eager to report first from the front lines. He was struck by an 88mm shell, a tragic reminder of the ever-present danger. Yet, these brief moments of relaxation were precious. They allowed us to momentarily pause, to gather strength, and to record memories that would later serve as vivid accounts of these historical moments. The small island we visited was charming in its own way, exuding a quaint and timeless atmosphere that immediately drew us in. Despite its age and historical significance, the island had been fortified in multiple ways over the years, reflecting its strategic importance. One of the most intriguing aspects we observed was how the natural environment interacted with human defenses. Specifically, during low tide, the beaches in the vicinity would become exposed, revealing wide, high, and often treacherous stretches of sand. To prevent unwelcome landings by enemy aircraft or ships, makeshift barriers had been created using sticks embedded directly into the sand, serving as rudimentary but effective markers to keep our planes from landing on concealed obstacles. During our explorations, we came across a small family of 3 brothers, a scene that touched us deeply. Interestingly, even the tallest, most strikingly blonde among them was still a boy, as I later learned from those caring for them. Their grandmother was the primary guardian, as their parents had been tragically killed in the Battle of St. Lo. One late afternoon, as the sun began to set, I wandered behind the island to capture some unique photographs from the seaside vantage point. The high tide in this region was quite dramatic. Receding waters would leave the island entirely exposed, creating a striking landscape that was both beautiful and sensitive. The tide would roll back swiftly, and the ever-present danger of quicksand in these areas meant I kept moving, not standing still for too long. The retreating waters carved intricate, unusual patterns into the sands, which I found incredibly fascinating to observe and photograph. Our stay at Saint Michel was brief. Shortly after, we continued our journey deeper into France. Our travels took us into Brittany, a region renowned for its stunning scenery and rich history. There, we discovered that the boys had found a lake, which offered a welcome retreat amidst the summer months. The fields remained lush and green, with crops still standing tall, a vivid reminder of the season's vitality. After weeks of fighting and hardship, the boys decided to indulge in a well-deserved bath in that pristine lake, a privilege granted them since they were actively engaged in the battles around St. Malo. Historically, St. Malo was a significant stronghold, famously holding out against German forces for many months, almost until the war's very end. The toughness and resilience displayed by the American troops in places like St. Malo, combined with their sense of humor, played crucial roles in their ultimate victory, as humor often bolstered morale and strength in difficult times. While exploring the countryside, we also came across small rivers that proved to be invaluable for freshening up or refreshing ourselves. These tiny but vital waterways spread throughout France and were a constant source of relief whenever time permitted. A group of fellow correspondents often traveled together, sharing these moments of respite. Among them was Ralph Moss, positioned at the front, followed by Hurry Brick and Joe Priestley. In one memorable encounter, we also had the opportunity to see Edward G. Robinson, a renowned actor who had come to Normandy to entertain the troops. His visit was part of a series of morale-boosting performances held in a barn not far from the front lines. During the show, during what was supposed to be a brief intermission, system alarms awakened us. The shells had grown dangerously close. It was a reminder of the constant danger that surrounded us. Yet Robinson's ability to act naturally under such conditions was remarkable. Simply pointing a camera at him was enough to capture an authentic moment amidst chaos. Eventually, we found ourselves in Rambouillet, a town located about 52 kilometers from Paris, which served as a key headquarters for the numerous war correspondents covering the front. Among friends we encountered there were Ernie Pyle, who was on the left in the group photo, George Stevens, a highly respected Hollywood director, myself, and Pete Carroll. Shortly after these photographs were taken, Ernie Pyle decided to return to the United States. Later, he traveled to the Pacific Theater, where he tragically lost his life. George Stevens, widely known for his contributions to Hollywood filmmaking, would pass away only a few years later, but not before capturing some of the most enduring images of the war. Almost every correspondent, including ourselves, was eager to reach the gates of Paris, longing to witness the historic moment of liberation and to document the city's resilience and renewal amid the chaos of war. As I previously mentioned, we learned that General Eisenhower had authorized the 2nd French Armored Division to move into the city of Paris because, ultimately, the primary goal was to defeat the enemy, and capturing Paris itself was not deemed essential at that stage. The strategists believed that attempting to take the city directly might cause significant delays, so rather than engaging in a costly and complicated assault, they aimed to avoid fighting within the city altogether. Their plan was to navigate around Paris and allow the French forces to be the ones to enter and reclaim their capital, thereby honoring the French nation and their contribution to the liberation. The commanding officer of the 2nd Armored Division, a general, decided not to permit war correspondents to accompany his troops into the city, primarily because he wanted to prevent any exchanges of fire until Paris was fully secured and under control. The sight of Paris coming into view was a source of great joy for us, especially since this city is renowned worldwide for its unparalleled beauty and historical significance. We were genuinely impressed by how the people of Paris gathered in large numbers to witness the momentous event. The first day of liberation was marked by numerous photographs and film shots, although I regret that I didn't manage to capture enough of these moments due to the overwhelming amount of activity and the urgency of the situation. Soon, General de Gaulle entered the city and led a grand parade along the sidewalks, which was nothing short of spectacular. I remember seeing him take the salute, a gesture of leadership, as a victorious crowd gathered around him, some of whom presented him with flowers, creating a heartfelt scene. At that time, de Gaulle was not yet widely recognized internationally, and only a handful of people were aware of his prior efforts in England, where he had made a name for himself before crossing the English Channel. However, his reputation quickly grew once he made his way into Paris, and it seemed as though every person in the city had come out to catch a glimpse of him. Watching him march down the boulevards was truly an awe-inspiring sight, a testament to his importance in the collective morale. Later that same day, our own troops also paraded through the streets of Paris, which filled us with pride and a sense of achievement. During the parade, unexpected chaos erupted when gunfire suddenly opened from the remnants of forces still loyal to the enemy, some of them from the fascist factions or remnants of the Wehrmacht that had been left behind. They appeared to be attempting to create panic among the populace. From the windows of buildings and from various vantage points, it was dangerous to stick your head outside, as shots could and did fly in unpredictably. This situation persisted for several hours, and I was caught right in the middle of it, witnessing firsthand the terrifying minutes where chaos reigned. I managed to take some photographs of civilians lying flat on the ground or seeking shelter under our vehicle, which, at that moment, was unable to move because the gunfire prevented us from retreating or advancing. The gunfire consisted mainly of small arms, yet de Gaulle refused to leave his position or show any signs of panic. His resolve was steadfast, even while danger was all around. The streets of Paris that day were filled with scenes of tension and resilience, as the city's inhabitants and soldiers alike endured the ongoing bursts of gunfire. The French forces eventually managed to apprehend some of those responsible for the shooting, or so we were told. It was suggested that much of this violence was a form of psychological warfare, an effort to test nerves and create chaos in the midst of ongoing conflict. Some of the buildings still held German soldiers, those who had remained at strategic headquarters or defensive positions, and they were loudly cursed and insulted by the French residents attempting to drive them out. Later in the day, we also captured footage of American troops marching through the city streets on their way toward the front lines. Wherever our units stopped, there was a lively exchange of gestures, such as champagne bottles traded in return for cigarettes, and conversations among French citizens eager to learn about the progress of the war. We had an opportunity to observe the city itself in a relatively undamaged state. Despite some intense small arms exchanges, the cityscape was largely intact. The iconic lions or statues, often considered symbols of Paris, had lost parts of their features, like the lion that lost its tail, but overall, most of the bridges spanning the river and the major structures remained unharmed. This resilience and preservation were remarkable given the immense destruction that predictable war could bring. This is the Opera House, an iconic landmark that immediately catches the eye. Since it was my very first journey to Paris, I took great pleasure in observing and absorbing the city's breathtaking beauty and unique charm. As I explored, I quickly noticed that Parisians had resumed their lively parades along the beautiful streets of the city, celebrating their newfound sense of liberty after the recent upheavals. It became clear that the famous Eiffel Tower, once believed to have been destroyed or repurposed for military use, remained remarkably intact and standing tall amidst the city's ruins. In fact, I was fortunate enough to receive the necessary permission to ascend the Eiffel Tower, eager to gaze down and see Paris from above, observing the city's layout and the extent of destruction below. Yet, despite the cheerful scenes and the splendid architecture, the reality of the situation was far more somber and challenging. Many essential infrastructure assets, including the railroads, were severely damaged or almost completely destroyed, making transportation and logistics incredibly difficult. There was practically no way to bring in supplies of food, and as we traveled through the city, we noticed large military trucks lined up, waiting to move into the city loaded with various kinds of supplies. These trucks were desperately needed, as the city faced widespread shortages not only of food but also of fuel, especially coal, which was critical for heating during the increasingly cold late months of the year. The cold weather added to the hardship, and the lack of transportation meant that essential supplies were not reaching the city's residents. There are photographs taken from the top of the Eiffel Tower showing the cityscape surrounding it, including the nearby buildings and streets. Around this time, we also observed military troops parading through the streets, symbolizing both the recent liberation and the ongoing efforts to restore order. However, soon enough, our mission called us to move on, and I had to leave Paris behind. From there, I found myself in the countryside, beyond the city limits, traveling into Belgium. Eventually, I managed to reach Brussels, a city that had also undergone significant changes. Among the sights I encountered were scenes from the WWII racetrack, which surprisingly was still open shortly after the liberation. This unexpected opening of the racetrack was a bright spot for many, but it was short-lived. The authorities swiftly ordered it to close again after a few days of activity. One aspect that struck everyone deeply was the impeccable and fashionable appearance of the French women. Despite the hardships and the occupation, they managed to dress beautifully and creatively, making the most of limited resources to present themselves elegantly and attractively. Some Allied officials found their resourcefulness somewhat annoying, as they believed it reflected a level of resilience that perhaps they hadn't expected under such conditions. Shortly after these observations, we came across street-side art galleries that had opened their doors, which raised questions about whether these establishments had been permitted before the liberation. Nevertheless, they quickly began operating once the city was freed. During this period, we encountered a painter actively working in the historic quarter of Paris, capturing the city's essence on canvas amidst the ruins. After leaving Paris behind, I traveled to an area called the Aransons. I took several photographs of the countryside here because the weather had turned much colder, and the trees were displaying their vivid fall colors, a fleeting reminder of the season's transition. One of the most heartbreaking sights was the town of Hules, which had been completely destroyed during the earlier breakthrough and attack at Bastogne. I had been in Bastogne just days before the offensive, and I was fortunate enough to escape before the heavy fighting and destruction took their toll. Still, I suspected that Bastogne's strategic location made it an ideal hiding spot for enemy troops, who indeed took refuge there. There are further visuals of military leaders and conversations about these events. One such scene shows General Collins speaking with General Maurice Rose, who was commanding the 3rd Armored Division. To add a poignant note, General Rose was later killed in Cologne, an unfortunate turn of events. It was a tragic incident, as the Allies believed Cologne to be well protected, yet enemy soldiers had infiltrated the area, and General Rose lost his life in the fighting. The units belonging to the 3rd Armored Division engaged in combat against enemy forces during this period, and we were fortunate enough to capture some footage of them in action. Interestingly, at one moment, these soldiers found themselves being entertained by German children, a stark contrast to the chaos of war. Our progress across France was met with an overwhelmingly warm reception from the local population. The civilians welcomed us with open arms and heartfelt gratitude. However, as we advanced into Germany, the nature of the reception changed dramatically. Instead of cheers and celebration, we observed that most homes in the German territories displayed white flags in front of them. These flags served unmistakably as signs of surrender, a silent acknowledgement of defeat. The children we encountered on our way to school were typical in appearance, innocent, curious, and indeed charming. But their innocence was contrasted sharply by the distant sound of gunfire, which was not far from where they stood. Many of them held their ears to shield themselves from the loud noises of our artillery, trying to escape the deafening sounds that marked the ongoing conflict. During our reconnaissance, we came upon the formidable defensive line known as the Siegfried Line, often called the Dragon's Teeth. These formidable barriers had been constructed once again, supposedly with the help of forced labor by enslaved workers. Surprisingly, these defensive structures were not particularly effective against our tanks, as our bulldozers easily cleared the earth and pushed it over the top of the fortifications, riding right through what was supposed to stop us. Despite this, the line stretched from one end of Germany to the other, a testament to the Germans' desperate efforts to keep the advancing Allied forces at bay. They perhaps believed that these barriers would slow or halt our progress. But of course, they did not succeed. The pace of the war in Germany was quickening at certain points, with battles intensifying and boundaries shifting rapidly. Soon enough, I found myself in the town of Aachen, which was under heavy fire when these particular images were recorded. That explains the absence of civilians in the scenes. Mortars and artillery shells were passing overhead constantly. The enemy held control of the central parts of the city as we conducted our reconnaissance, and we wondered aloud just how long this fierce fighting would continue. From our vantage point, we saw that the enemy troops were hiding behind piles of rubble and wreckage in the distance, quickly realizing that these reserves were stationed just a few blocks behind the front lines, waiting to be called into action when needed. I later learned that the captain seen in one of the photographs had been killed shortly thereafter during the ensuing combat. Someone in the audience remembered who he was and confirmed his fate. Following the events in Aachen, I was personally invited to fly back home, a prospect I welcomed eagerly. Returning home meant reuniting with loved ones and witnessing the aftermath of the immense conflict. On my arrival, I was able to visit cemeteries established along the Normandy beaches, high above the landing areas, where countless fallen soldiers are laid to rest. Additionally, I captured images of Berlin ravaged by relentless bombings. The city had suffered extensive destruction, with only fragments of its former grandeur standing amidst the ruins. The intensity of the Allied bombing campaign had left most of Berlin decimated. Very little of the city remained intact. These scenes serve as stark reminders that wars tend to destroy property and claim countless lives, often revealing that conflict ultimately achieves little beyond devastation. Perhaps someday, humanity will learn how to prevent war altogether, especially now that warfare has become so deadly that avoidance might be the only way to ensure our survival over the long term. Afterward, I also had the opportunity to photograph some of the German weaponry used during the initial invasion. One notable example is the V-2 rocket, which followed the earlier V-1 missiles. The V-1 had been a terror weapon in itself, but the V-2 represented a significant technological leap. These rockets could be launched over great distances with precision. It was the first time these types of rockets had been employed in warfare, marking a new phase in military technology and strategy. The Germans' use of V-2 rockets was indeed a frightening innovation, as they could be fired across vast expanses, causing destruction in distant locations, signaling a new level of threat in warfare. The V-1 flying bombs, which I heard rumbling overhead numerous times, sounded much like a motorcycle engine revving loudly in the sky. Each time their engines suddenly cut out, it would essentially trigger a catastrophic moment. The bomb would be released and sent hurtling toward its target. During that period, the Germans had developed jet-powered aircraft that were already in the skies before the war reached its conclusion. Among these advanced machines was a remarkably significant plane that was actually used in combat, setting a record for the number of American aircraft it shot down. If you observe closely, you will notice that this particular aircraft managed to bring down no fewer than 42 Russian planes before it was eventually captured by Allied forces. Within this exhibition, there is a display featuring one of the infamous Japanese kamikaze bombs, which a brave pilot was daring enough to handle. These kamikaze missions were particularly brutal because they were designed with a single, deadly purpose: to destroy the target along with the pilot's own life. The aircraft associated with these missions, I was told, was built by the enemy specifically to threaten New York City. It had the range to cross the ocean and return. The Germans even gave it an appropriate, if grim, nickname, Alice Kaputt, which roughly translates to Alice is dead. Moving further, we come across some images that illustrate what I believe the future of warfare might look like. Images of destruction and devastation. Among them is the explosion of the atomic bomb in New Mexico, a sight that often leaves me contemplating the immense power harnessed in that single moment. Whenever I show these pictures, I hope they serve as a stark reminder of the horrors inflicted during World War II, a conflict that could very well have been even worse. It's important to recall, as one scientist famously said, that the atomic bomb is here to stay, leaving us to ask whether humanity itself will endure. And with that thought, I conclude this presentation, grateful for your attention. Now, let's turn to a different question that has puzzled many. What caused the once dominant air force of Germany to collapse so completely? Was there a clear turning point or key event that rendered the German Luftwaffe powerless in the face of the combined might of Britain, America, and the Soviet Union? For the first time in history, we are invited to step into the heart of this debate as we attempt to unravel the reasons behind the Luftwaffe's failure, arguably one of the greatest enigmas in aviation history. What exactly led to the Luftwaffe's downfall? To answer that, we need to look back to the rise of Nazi Germany, beginning in 1933 when Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany, eventually ascending to the role of Führer. As the leader, he established a totalitarian regime that exerted absolute control over the nation. Driven by a desire to reclaim territories lost after the Treaty of Versailles, the Nazi regime understood early on that building a formidable air force was essential for their expansionist ambitions. In 1935, this goal became a formal reality when the Luftwaffe was officially established. Although its existence had been in preparation long before, it was only now sanctioned on paper. The man chosen to lead this air force was Hermann Göring, a prominent fighter pilot from the First World War who had gained fame for his aerial combat skills. Interestingly, Göring was not particularly interested in the technological aspects of aircraft design. He once dismissed aircraft components as a box with coils, implying a certain disdain for mechanical intricacies. His attitude was rooted in the belief that courage and bravery in combat mattered far more than technological innovation, reflecting the mindset of a war veteran rather than an engineer. Nonetheless, the Nazi regime possessed several strategic advantages that many other nations lacked at the time. Their aircraft industry was highly advanced, symbolized by cutting-edge designs from companies like Messerschmitt, Dornier, Focke-Wulf, Junkers, and Faluoff. These names stood for engineering excellence, pushing aerodynamics to new, unprecedented heights. Additionally, the educated German population played a crucial role, capable of mass-producing aircraft efficiently and effectively. By 1938, these efforts bore fruit. The German aircraft industry was producing more than 5,000 airplanes annually, a staggering figure that underscored their technological and industrial capabilities at that time. A year later, that figure rises dramatically, surging to over 8,000 units, reflecting the intense emphasis that the Nazi regime placed on the strategic importance of air power. This rapid increase underscores their unwavering belief in the vital role of the Air Force as a decisive element in modern warfare. What the Germans aimed to achieve was not merely the development of new aircraft and technologies, but rather the integration of these innovations into a distinctly traditional framework of combat, one that had served their military well in past conflicts. They sought to adapt ancient principles of warfare by grafting cutting-edge technological advancements onto long-standing doctrines. This approach, I believe, set the Germans apart from their neighboring countries during the tumultuous years of the 1920s and 30s. Unlike some nations that looked primarily toward future innovations, Germany appeared to focus more on honoring and refining past military paradigms, blending old strategies with new technological tools in a way that seemed to favor continuity over radical change. Before the outbreak of hostilities in August of 1939, the German aerial arsenal was truly impressive by any standards. The Luftwaffe was well equipped with several formidable aircraft designs poised for combat. Among these was the Messerschmitt Bf 109, a highly advanced single-engine fighter aircraft that would go down in history as one of the most effective of its era. Alongside it was the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, a dive bomber famed for its terrifying precision and destructive power. The Luftwaffe also boasted the Henschel HS 111 and the Dornier Du-17, two leading medium-range bombers, often considered among the finest in the world at that time. Additionally, Germany possessed the largest and most extensive air transport industry globally, exemplified by the Junkers Ju-52, a reliable workhorse that would later become central to the logistical efforts of the upcoming German offensives. Even with this arsenal of remarkable aircraft, there was a glaring omission, most notably the absence of dedicated strategic bombers to match the capabilities seen in other nations' air forces. Historians of the Second World War frequently point out that this lack of strategic long-range bombers was a significant shortcoming. This deficit did not go unnoticed, especially by military strategists. As early as 1935, General Walther Voss, a prominent figure in the German military aviation sphere, recognized the critical importance of long-range aircraft and fervently advocated for their development to counter potential enemies, most notably the Soviet Union. General Voss championed what he called the European bomber, a concept rooted in the belief that air power could deliver a decisive blow deep into enemy territory from the very onset of conflict. His perspective was that for Germany to be truly formidable, it must possess the ability to strike at the core of the adversary's infrastructure and morale through sustained aerial bombardment. Voss held a firm conviction that in a future war against Russia, the destruction of the industrial heartland, particularly the factories and transportation hubs in the Ural Mountains, would be essential for victory. Voss emphasized that controlling the skies and deploying long-range bombers capable of reaching vast distances would enable Germany to project power across entire regions. He wrote passionately about the strategic importance of air supremacy, asserting that air power carries the war right into the heart of enemy territory from the moment hostilities commence. It strikes at the very foundation of the enemy's fighting capacity and erodes the will of the people to resist. His ideas reflected a belief that air forces could play a decisive role not only in battlefield tactics, but also in shaping the political and economic landscape of wartime nations. Consequently, he actively promoted the development of long-range bombers with the aim of establishing an aerial striking force capable of devastating Soviet industrial centers. To turn this vision into reality, Voss proposed specific technical requirements for these advanced aircraft. He encouraged both the Dornier and Junkers companies to work on designs for substantial long-range bombers. Out of this effort came prototypes like the Dornier Do-19 and the Junkers Ju-89. However, compared to the latest North American models, such as the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, which boasted superior performance, durability, and payload capacity, these German prototypes fell short. Their development was hindered by technical limitations, and neither aircraft progressed beyond the prototype stage in any meaningful way. In the tragic year of 1936, the death of General Voss in a plane crash dealt a severe blow to the ambitious strategic bomber plans rooted in his doctrine. The projects centered on the Dornier Do-19 and the Junkers Ju-89 were ultimately abandoned under the leadership of Hermann Göring. Unlike Voss, Göring did not fully align himself with the long-range bomber strategy. He tended to favor the military doctrine espoused by Adolf Hitler, which emphasized rapid, decisive victories, so-called blitzkrieg tactics, where the use of heavy, long-range bombers was considered less necessary. Göring believed that swift ground maneuvering and concentrated air attacks could secure victories without engaging in prolonged aerial campaigns that required strategic bombers. There was a practical discussion regarding the production capacities of twin-engine versus four-engine aircraft. When asked how many twin-engine bombers could be produced for every four-engine one, the answer given was approximately 2.5 to 1. To this, the field marshal responded that Adolf Hitler was not concerned with the size or carrying capacity of the bombers, but, rather, with the sheer number that could be built. Essentially, he prioritized quantity over size, considering massed aerial forces more strategically valuable than individual, more powerful long-range bombers. This viewpoint reflected a broader military philosophy that prioritized the numerical advantage of aircraft as a means of overwhelming an enemy through attrition and sheer scale, rather than relying solely on heavier, far-reaching aircraft designs. It is essential to recognize that the decision not to pursue the development of long-range bombers should not be viewed as a strategic failure. For Germany, the prospect of building such aircraft posed significant logistical and economic challenges that ultimately rendered the endeavor impractical. The raw materials necessary for constructing long-range bombers, such as substantial quantities of rubber, various metals, and high-grade fuel, would have had to be extensively imported often at considerable expense. During the era of the Air Force development, it was estimated that around 4,500 tons of aluminum were required each month solely for aircraft manufacturing. However, at that time, only about half of that amount was readily available to the German war effort, given the constraints of resource allocation and industrial capacity under wartime conditions. Consequently, pursuing an aviation strategy based on long-range bombers was simply not economical or feasible within the economic realities of Germany's industrial landscape. Instead, the Germans gravitated toward a different approach that came to exemplify their concept of warfare, namely, a tactical air force emphasizing close air support and quick, decisive strikes. The tactical air force was designed to operate in close coordination with ground units, targeting specific military objectives and supporting rapid mobile operations during the initial phases of the conflict. The German strategy prioritized swift, localized victories, particularly during the early weeks of hostilities, aiming to weaken enemy forces through concentrated, tactical aerial assaults. This approach reflected a belief that offensive success was best achieved through targeted, predetermined operations rather than prolonged strategic bombing campaigns that depended heavily on extensive resources and long-term planning. Historically, Germany had not demonstrated particular skill in strategic long-term planning at the level of total war, a competency that the Allies, notably during World War II, executed with exceptional efficiency. This shortcoming could be traced back to historical patterns dating as far back as the Prussian military tradition, which traditionally emphasized rapid, decisive victories over sustained, strategic campaigns. Germans believed they must secure swift victories in each conflict, under the assumption that failure to do so would mean inevitable defeat. This mindset inevitably limited Germany's capacity to undertake large-scale strategic warfare predicated on the immense industrial and economic resources of rival nations such as the United States, which would have been necessary for sustained, strategic aerial campaigns. As the war began to unfold, the German Air Force, known as the Luftwaffe, demonstrated remarkable success when operating in close cooperation with ground forces during the early years of the conflict. In the initial phase, German tactics and coordination allowed for the rapid and relatively effortless conquest of Poland. The Luftwaffe played a crucial role in diminishing Poland's resistance through precise and concentrated aerial attacks. Similarly, during the invasion of Norway, the Luftwaffe's striking capabilities enabled German forces to dominate the skies and swiftly seize control of Norwegian territory, overcoming British resistance with ease. Throughout the year 1940, the German Air Force's power was on full display, as it dismantled the defenses of the Low Countries and proved capable of overcoming the formidable defenses of France. By the end of that year, it appeared that nothing could halt the relentless advance of Nazi forces across Europe, signaling that their military superiority, bolstered significantly by their aerial prowess, might soon lead to the complete takeover of the continent. Indeed, the Luftwaffe's performance during this period was instrumental in securing Germany's initial victories during the early years of the Second World War. When referring to these early successes, it is important to consider not just the first 6 months, but the entirety of the first 2 years, during which the momentum and apparent invincibility of German forces cast a long shadow over Europe. German air competence was especially notable at a tactical level, demonstrating excellent coordination with ground operations to destroy critical targets like enemy supply depots, communication lines, and transportation hubs. Moreover, at an operational level, dealing with campaigns that involved moving large formations of troops and maintaining logistics, the Luftwaffe was highly effective, especially in disrupting enemy supply chains and ensuring that German units received the necessary reinforcements and material to sustain their advances. The fall of France marked a pivotal moment, leaving Britain as the sole major Allied nation that still stood in opposition to the expanding German Empire. To decisively eliminate Britain as an obstacle, German military planners formulated a strategy known as Operation Sea Lion. The plan entailed first establishing dominance in the skies over the English Channel to achieve air superiority, thereby clearing the way for the deployment of ground forces onto British soil. The prospect of invading Britain hinged critically on the Luftwaffe's success in this aerial battle, as control of the skies would deny British forces the ability to mount effective resistance from the air and would facilitate the subsequent landing operations for the invasion. During this decisive phase, the Luftwaffe faced an unexpected and significant setback, their very first aerial defeat during the campaign. Despite their extensive preparations and previous successes, the German Air Force was unable to maintain air dominance over Britain. The Royal Air Force responded with remarkable resilience, deploying high-performance fighters such as the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane. Through skillful piloting and effective tactics, these aircraft were capable of intercepting and pushing back German fighters along the coast of Britain, which prevented the Luftwaffe from securing complete control of the skies over the English Channel and southern England. This aerial confrontation marked a turning point in the Battle of Britain, exposing critical vulnerabilities within the German air campaign. Among the most glaring shortcomings was the Luftwaffe's lack of coordinated effort with the German Navy, known as the Kriegsmarine. This failure at the strategic level hampered overall effectiveness because, without synchronized operations, the Luftwaffe could not fully secure control of the critical maritime approaches necessary for a successful invasion. The persistent disconnect between the two branches meant that despite initial successes and formidable aircraft, the Germans could not achieve the comprehensive dominance required for an invasion of Britain, ultimately leading to the abandonment of the planned landings and forcing Germany to seek alternative strategies as the war progressed. Göring stated quite emphatically that all aircraft capable of flight belonged to him, and that any efforts by the German Navy to seize control of the airspace were met with fierce resistance. He was deeply committed to protecting what he considered to be his domain, and he fought vehemently against any incursions into the aerial theater. Interestingly, Göring went behind the back of his superior, Goering, and directly approached Hitler. As a result of this clandestine action, he managed to secure the assignment of approximately a dozen Focke-Wulf Condor aircraft to his command. When Göring discovered that his plans had been circumvented in this manner, he was filled with rage to the extent that he severed all cooperation with the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. Despite Admiral Raeder's efforts to establish a separate air force dedicated solely to the Navy's needs, Göring refused to give his approval for such a step, viewing it as a threat to the existing military hierarchy. This friction between the services stemmed largely from their competing ambitions. Each branch desperately sought recognition for being the primary contributor to the victory of the fatherland. Of course, the long-standing rivalry between Germany's Navy and its Air Force deepened this division. The Navy referred to itself as the Imperial Navy, asserting its superiority and tradition, while the Air Force branded itself as the Nazi Air Force, emphasizing its distinct identity and modernity. Such labels carried more than just words. They reflected contrasting attitudes, cultures, and visions of how the military effort should be organized and prioritized. In retrospect, Göring's unwavering stance ultimately proved disastrous. As Germany and Britain engaged in fierce combat both over the skies and across the oceans, the consequences of this internal discord became painfully clear. Winston Churchill famously observed that Britain's greatest peril during this period was the Battle of the Atlantic, where the Germans had achieved enormous success employing their submarines, which sank countless ships vital to Britain's survival. Churchill was quite right in his assessment. Britain's lifeline was the Atlantic supply route, and if that route were severed, the island nation would be plunged into crisis. Britain relied heavily on shipments of supplies, food, and war materials from North America, making control of the Atlantic a matter of survival for the small island nation. After France's defeat, Germany established strategic bases along the now-occupied French coasts, widening the theater of operations and hardening the threat to these vital shipping routes. Had the German aerial forces worked more closely with their naval assets, or if they had established a dedicated naval aviation wing, the impact on Britain could have been even more devastating. The Focke-Wulf Condor bomber, despite its limitations, served as a potent weapon against merchant vessels. With only about a dozen of these aircraft, the Germans managed to sink approximately 85 merchant ships, amounting to over 300,000 tons of shipping, crippling the vital supply lines. Their deployment of these aircraft proved to be quite effective, and when combined with the threat of magnetic mines dropped by Luftwaffe planes into the English Channel, the Germans might have starved Britain into surrender. This would have marked a significant failure on the part of the Luftwaffe, illustrating critical shortcomings in coordination and strategic planning. One of the recurring problems was the complete lack of coordination between the German Navy and the Luftwaffe. They operated largely independently, without harmonizing their efforts. This misalignment hampered efforts to maximize their combined impact on the enemy. As the war progressed, Germany faced a stalemate on the Western Front, prompting a strategic reassessment. Rather than continuing to press directly against Britain, Germany decided to shift its focus and keep the British naval blockade at bay through indirect means. Simultaneously, they turned their attention eastward, recognizing that their alliance with the Soviet Union could potentially be the key to a broader victory. This shift in strategy culminated in a massive land offensive known as Operation Barbarossa. In this plan, roughly 3 million Nazi soldiers, equipped with rifles, tanks, and aircraft, launched the largest land invasion in history. The operation aimed to subdue the Soviet Union, opening up an eastern front that would stretch the resources and defenses of the Soviets to their limits. The scale of the invasion was unprecedented, marking a defining moment in the war and illustrating how internal divisions, strategic miscalculations, and relentless ambition shaped the course of events during this tumultuous period. Germany's military forces, employing fewer than 3,000 aircraft, significantly less than the number used in their campaign against France, remarkably managed to push Soviet troops back all the way to the suburbs of Moscow. This impressive feat highlights the strategic resilience and adaptability of the German military despite limited aerial resources. The decision to launch Operation Barbarossa, which aimed to invade the Soviet Union, revealed a critical vulnerability in Germany's military infrastructure: the insufficient attention given to ground-based maintenance and repair facilities. While the Luftwaffe would repair damaged aircraft within Germany's borders during short, tactical campaigns such as the invasion of France, this approach proved disastrous during a protracted, attritional conflict like the Eastern Front. When aircrews fought far away from their home bases, the process of repairing aircraft and returning them to the front lines was painfully slow and inefficient. By the year 1941, fewer than 30% of Luftwaffe airfields remained operational, a staggering statistic given that Germany was embroiled in a simultaneous two-front war. Reflecting on these shortcomings after the war, Field Marshal Hermann Milch criticized the Luftwaffe's rigid organizational structure, which divided responsibilities into 4 territorially based commands. He argued that such a division was grossly inadequate to support a war effort extending well beyond the borders of the Third Reich. The disastrous decision to commence the invasion on June 22, 1941, would ultimately prove to be a catastrophic mistake. For leaders like Hermann Göring, who had never experienced combat on the Eastern Front during the First World War, their underestimation of Soviet resilience and industrial capacity was profound. They dismissed the Soviet Union as backward, a notion fostered by Hitler's own misleading assumptions, and failed to appreciate that the Soviets had moved their industrial complexes far beyond the Ural Mountains, out of reach of German bomber attacks. These factories, hidden deep within the Soviet interior, became haunting figures of failure for the Germans, reminiscent of past mistakes that seemed to echo from the legend of Genoa. Following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, Nazi Germany made the reckless decision to declare war against the United States. Prior to this declaration, Hitler dismissed any notion of America posing a serious threat, viewing its industrial strength as an insignificant arsenal of democracy. By joining the war against the United States, Hitler inadvertently added an immensely powerful opponent to Germany's growing list of enemies, as America's industrial capacity was unmatched. With vast oceans separating the American continent from the European and North African theaters of battle, the United States could sustain production while remaining relatively insulated from direct aerial bombardment or ground invasion. According to one military historian, Britain would have long abandoned its resistance if not for the vital support it received from America. By the mid-1940s, as Germany grappled with severe shortages of aluminium and copper, critical raw materials, America had become fully stocked with these resources and countless others necessary for war production. By 1944, the United States was capable of producing over 96,000 aircraft annually, an astonishing rate of one plane every 5 minutes. This output more than doubled Germany's, which struggled with its limited industrial base. It is crucial to recognize that as early as 1940, Britain, despite suffering unprecedented losses of shipping to German U-boats, was still outproducing Germany in aircraft manufacturing. The British had demonstrated remarkable ingenuity by developing innovative aircraft such as the de Havilland Mosquito, made primarily from plywood. This flexibility and resourcefulness allowed Britain to manufacture outstanding aircraft despite shortages and adversity. In stark contrast, by 1941, with Nazi forces embroiled in a brutal two-front war, Germany's total aircraft production barely exceeded 11,000 units, marking only a modest increase of around 3,000 planes compared to the beginning of the conflict. This sluggish rate of growth underscored the limitations of their industrial capacity and the growing hardships faced by the German wartime economy, reducing their chances of maintaining sustained military success on multiple fronts. It becomes evident that the total output produced by the Third Reich's military-industrial complex was significantly less than its true potential. One of the fundamental reasons behind this underperformance can be traced back to the failures of the German Luftwaffe's development and procurement processes. A critical flaw was their persistent inability to establish a coherent, logical approach to designing, manufacturing, and developing aircraft. Throughout the war, prototypes were often built with high hopes, only to be subsequently abandoned when they did not meet expectations. Sometimes these designs were reconstructed, modified, and then abandoned once again, often under the direct orders of Adolf Hitler. In some cases, these aircraft would undergo multiple cycles of reconstruction, and there's even evidence that some projects made it into limited production, only to differ drastically from the original designer's visions and intentions. This chaotic approach to planning and production illustrates a stark lack of strategic foresight and organized management, problems rooted in the decisions taken by key figures in the German military aviation establishment. This systemic shortcoming can be notably linked to the person who assumed control of Luftwaffe production in the year 1936, well before the outbreak of hostilities. His name was Ernst Udet, a celebrated fighter ace from the First Great War. His appointment to a position of enormous influence came when Hermann Göring replaced Wilhelm Wimmer as the chief of Luftwaffe technical development. Udet's ascent marked the beginning of what could arguably be considered the third, and perhaps most significant, failure of the Luftwaffe's aircraft development program. It's crucial to understand that Göring placed talented but inexperienced individuals in charge of aerospace innovation, and in Udet's case, this decision could be seen as a tragic misjudgment. Udet, who was primarily known for his flying skills in aerial combat, was not well versed in the intricacies of aircraft engineering or the complexities of strategic aerospace planning. His predecessor, Wimmer, had been remarkably successful in overseeing the development of the Luftwaffe's second-generation aircraft. These included notable models like the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Junkers Ju 87 Stuka dive bomber, and the Henschel H-111 bomber. These aircraft had been carefully designed, tested, and refined during the pre-war years, forming the backbone of the Luftwaffe's early air power. However, once Udet took over, the course of aircraft development took a sharp downturn. Instead of building on the solid foundation laid by his predecessor, Udet's focus shifted toward projects that were often disconnected from strategic reality or technical feasibility. One of his pet projects was the development of dive bombers. His fascination with this type of aircraft was influenced by a demonstration of dive bombing techniques he had observed in America during the interwar period. Convinced that all German bombers should be capable of diving from high altitudes, Udet pushed aggressively for the modification of existing and planned aircraft to serve as dive bombers. This led to the development of the four-engine bomber known as the Heinkel He-177. Fascinated with the concept, Udet insisted that this aircraft, undergoing ongoing development, should be designed explicitly as a dive bomber. Despite objections from engineers who understood the technical challenges involved, Udet's insistence prevailed. He ordered that the He-177 be converted into a dive bomber, which required significant modifications to its airframe. The aircraft's wings had to be reinforced to withstand the stresses of high-speed diving, which entailed efforts to reduce aerodynamic drag. Engineers experimented with mounting the four engines differently, placing them in pairs, front and back, each within a single nacelle on each wing, rather than configuring them in traditional tandem arrangements. This unusual engine setup caused severe overheating problems because the engines generated enormous amounts of heat due to inadequate cooling and airflow issues. The excessive heat frequently resulted in engine failures and constant overheating, thereby severely hampering operational reliability. These technical difficulties, coupled with the fundamental flaws in the aircraft's design and the misguided emphasis on diving capability at the expense of other performance parameters, led to substantial delays in its development. In many ways, the Heinkel He-177 became symbolic of Germany's failure to produce an effective four-engine strategic bomber during the entire duration of the war. The aircraft quickly acquired the nickname the Dead Racehorse, a reflection of its poor performance, frequent breakdowns, and the fact that only a limited number managed to fly in operational conditions. Its unique tandem engine layout and the relentless push by Udet to make it a dive bomber proved disastrous from the outset. The plane was essentially a technical and strategic failure from its inception, and it fell far short of the expectations placed upon it. The Heinkel 177, along with the Messerschmitt Bf 210, stands as one of the numerous major miscalculations made by the Luftwaffe during its attempt to modernize and expand. Another serious setback was the development of the Messerschmitt Me 210, intended to replace the older Me 110. Unfortunately, the Me 210 was plagued with a multitude of issues, many of which remained unresolved even as production was launched, reflecting a persistent failure to integrate technical improvements effectively. When Udet proposed his own aircraft design, named the Messerschmitt Me 210, the aviation authorities responded with enthusiasm, declaring it an excellent project. They swiftly ordered an enormous number of units, likely 10,000 or more, anticipating that this new aircraft would rapidly bolster Germany's air capabilities. However, the reality was starkly different. The aircraft had barely flown in its initial tests before mass production began, leading to a situation where an aircraft so early in its development phase was being churned out in vast quantities. This rapid, unchecked transition from prototype to production exacerbated existing problems, resulting in an aircraft that was technologically flawed and insufficiently tested. The unfortunate outcome was that these aircraft, rushed into the production lines, often failed to meet operational expectations, thereby complicating the Luftwaffe's strategic planning and compromising overall air power effectiveness. In summary, these failures, stemming from flawed leadership, misguided priorities, and technical miscalculations, highlight the inherent difficulties faced by the German aircraft industry during the war. They demonstrate how strategic vision, when clouded by personal obsession or misjudgment, can lead to monumental setbacks, preventing a nation from fully realizing the potential of its industrial might at a critical juncture in history. The situation for Germany's Air Force during this period was nothing short of catastrophic, leaving a mark of failure that haunted them for years to come. The consequences of their missteps and miscalculations proved so severe that they never truly managed to recover from this disastrous chapter in their aviation history. To attempt to salvage their strained aircraft fleet, they undertook a painstaking process, converting many of their existing Me 210 models into Me 410s. This involved dismantling the original aircraft entirely, then reassembling them using new parts in a complex and resource-intensive effort aimed at transforming these planes into functional and combat-ready machines. Such a task demanded considerable effort, time, and raw materials, commodities that were becoming increasingly scarce as the war progressed. As this effort unfolded, it was often remarked with a degree of cynicism among aircraft industry insiders that everything Udet touched seemed to turn to dust, emphasizing the apparent futility and chaos surrounding his leadership during this tumultuous period. Under his watch, only a single aircraft managed to be regarded as a true success, the Fäller-Wolf 190, yet even this one stood as a rare bright spot amidst a sea of failures and disillusionment. The reluctance of leadership to confront the difficult but necessary decisions further compounded Germany's woes, as precious resources were diverted to projects that, during the harsh realities of wartime, proved unattainable and impractical. This inefficiency undoubtedly hampered their overall military-industrial efforts. By the year of our Lord 1941, the strategic landscape had shifted dramatically. The Germans found themselves in urgent need of long-range bombers capable of conducting deep strikes into enemy territory. While the Americans had already introduced the formidable B-17 Flying Fortress, the British had redesigned and improved upon the earlier Avro-Manchester aircraft, transforming it into the 4-engine Avro-Lancaster. In stark contrast, Germany's production of 4-engine bombers lagged alarmingly behind the Allies, a disparity that grew increasingly pronounced. Wilhelm Udet, despite his series of failures and misjudgments, succumbed to despair and took his own life in this very year. His death left the Luftwaffe in disarray, struggling to regain its footing amid mounting losses and operational challenges. Meanwhile, the tide turned more definitively against Germany with the Soviet victory at the Battle of Stalingrad, a turning point that pushed German forces back on multiple fronts and signaled the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. As American and British strategic bombers launched relentless campaigns from the sky, targeting German factories, infrastructure, and city centers, a long-standing military philosophy, once advocated by General Alva, began to manifest its destructive power. The strategic bombing campaigns proved to be a crucial element in systematically weakening the German war effort, crippling their capacity to sustain prolonged military campaigns and undermining morale across the nation. In response to these mounting pressures, the German war machine, under the stewardship of Field Marshal Göring, saw some progress in production capabilities. Monthly aircraft output increased steadily, reaching approximately 25,000 planes annually, a noteworthy increase by any standards. However, despite this apparent growth, the figures paled in comparison to the staggering volumes produced by the Allied powers. The United States procurement policies, which evolved into an immense bureaucratic machinery housed within the War Department, and later the Pentagon during the formation of the United States Military Command, enabled the Americans to field an industrial war effort that far surpassed Germany's capabilities. The Germans simply found themselves incapable of matching this level of industrial productivity and logistical coordination. By the year of our Lord 1944, the disparity in aircraft production had become even more glaring. Germany's aircraft manufacturing rates were outpaced by the Allies' output by a ratio of more than 4-to-1. At this point, the Germans faced an almost insurmountable challenge in competing with the economic and industrial behemoths of the United States and the Soviet Union. Though much has been written by historians about the Allies' effective coordination in resource allocation and material distribution, very little attention has been given to Germany's failure to leverage its own allies' industrial capacities efficiently. This oversight, or perhaps strategic misjudgment, was part of a broader pattern of German shortcomings during the war. For example, Germany's relationship with its allies was complicated and insufficiently coordinated. While many nations such as Romania, Hungary, and Finland possessed some capability to produce aircraft, they lacked the technological expertise, manufacturing infrastructure, and resource support that could have been provided by the fatherland to significantly bolster their output. Perhaps the most pivotal mistake of all was related to Italy. Though Italy was officially part of Germany's Axis alliance, it was neither on the same level of industrial prowess nor in sync with German war ambitions. Italy's own air force was severely damaged, and its capacity to produce aircraft was limited. In their reluctance to provide Italy with licenses and engine designs, Germany deprived its ally of the means to produce German aircraft on Italian soil, an opportunity that could have potentially tripled Italy's aircraft output. Under that scenario, Italy might have manufactured as many as 30,000 planes during the war, a significant contribution to the Axis aerial force. Furthermore, if Italian factories had been strategically located outside of the range of Allied bombers, particularly during the critical year of 1942, they could have served as a sanctuary for aircraft production, possibly influencing the Mediterranean theater's outcome in favor of the Axis. In addition to Italy, Other German allies such as Romania, Hungary, and Finland did possess the capacity to make some aircraft, but they were hampered by a lack of advanced knowledge, experience, and resources. These nations' industrial bases were simply not robust enough to supplement the German war effort meaningfully without significant assistance from the core German industries. Consequently, the overall effectiveness of Germany's alliance network remained limited at a crucial juncture in the conflict, further compromising the Axis power's strategic position on the battlefield. Had these nations been granted the necessary licenses to produce and develop their own Nazi aircraft within their borders, it is conceivable that this coalition might have significantly altered the course of history, possibly tipping the scales in favor of Germany during its critical struggle against the Soviet Union in the year 1941. The decision by the German leadership not to fully harness and utilize the industrial and military potential of these allied countries can be largely attributed to Germany's relentless pursuit of dominance and control as the supreme global power. This overarching desire to maintain strict supremacy left little room for collaborative resource sharing, even with trusted partner nations. There was a noticeable undercurrent of resentment against the Italians among top Nazi officials, many of whom viewed them as merely riding on the coattails of German military successes, rather than contributing equally to the war effort. Our collective feeling, especially given the lessons learned from the First World War, was that we would have preferred the Italians to be fighting on the opposite side. Prominent German figures, like Hermann Göring, considered these smaller countries primarily as suppliers of essential natural resources, with the German homeland acting as the primary provider of machinery and finished products to support their efforts. This perspective highlights yet another tragic failure of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, which struggled to fully capitalize on the available resources and Allied potential. In the early months of 1944, Germany introduced the Messerschmitt 26-2, a revolutionary jet aircraft that offered hope of effectively combating the formidable Allied aerial defenses, such as the flying fortresses and interceptor fighters that were wreaking havoc on German cities and military installations. As the war progressed, Germany succeeded in producing the world's first operational jet aircraft in large quantities, with the Messerschmitt 26-2, commonly known by its nickname, the Me-262, becoming the flagship of this technological leap forward. Seen today, the Me-262's sleek, modern lines continue to impress aviation enthusiasts and historians alike, standing as a testament to German engineering prowess during that era. From my perspective, and I have expressed this many times before, the Me-262 was arguably the most formidable aircraft of the entire Second World War. It was a machine ahead of its time, years ahead in terms of technology, that embodied the innovative spirit of the German fatherland. Nonetheless, this remarkable aircraft also came to symbolize some of the indecisiveness and bureaucratic dysfunction that plagued the Nazi war effort. Unfortunately, the development and deployment of the Me-262 were hampered by an exceptionally complex and arcane procurement process that existed within Germany at the time. Competent aircraft engineers initially designed solid and promising specifications, but these designs were repeatedly altered and diluted by higher military authorities within the Luftwaffe, often under the influence of Adolf Hitler himself. In the case of the Me-262, its potential was further compromised when Professor Mesched, an aircraft expert, informed Hitler that the aircraft could carry as much as 1,000 kilograms of bombs. This revelation prompted a furious response from Field Marshal Milch, who, in a fit of rage, told the Führer that even the most inexperienced observer could see that the aircraft was fundamentally a fighter and not suited to serve as a heavy bomber. Following months of hesitation and internal debate, the decision was made to adapt the Me-262 for use as a fighter bomber, significantly reducing its offensive potential and, in effect, stripping away some of the power that could have been a game-changer in the skies. Despite possessing this extraordinary technological wonder weapon, the Luftwaffe faced a critical shortage of trained pilots capable of efficiently flying and deploying the Me-262 in combat. This became one of the final and most devastating failures of the German Air Force during the war. At the height of its power, the Wehrmacht's best pilots received around 250 hours of flight training, a figure notably higher than that of the British pilots at the time, before being thrust into combat. During the initial phases of the war, particularly in 1940 and 1941, this training regimen was considered adequate, and the Luftwaffe arrogantly underestimated the importance of extensive pilot preparation, operating under the naive assumption that the war would be swift and, therefore, training short. As the tide of the conflict began to turn against Germany in 1942, the Luftwaffe's attitude shifted, and training hours were reduced further, with pilots now receiving less than 200 hours of flight practice. In contrast, Allied pilots, benefiting from the growing demand for experienced airmen, accumulated over 300 hours of training before being deployed to face the enemy. With the deteriorating strategic situation and mounting losses, German authorities resorted to increasingly shortcut procedures, aiming to churn out every possible pilot to fill the gaps in their depleted ranks, often at the cost of flying proficiency and combat readiness. Despite the significant advancements in pilot training methods, by the year of 1944, the average duration of combat pilot training had notably decreased to just under 100 hours. To put this into perspective, such training hours were only about a quarter of the extensive instruction given to pilots flying aircraft like the P-51 Mustang or the P-47 Thunderbolt. This sharp reduction in training time meant that many new pilots entered combat with comparatively limited preparation. As the Allies succeeded in establishing air superiority over German territory, the skies shifted dramatically in their favor, transforming into what could be described as a deadly turkey shoot for the Axis pilots. American and British aircraft engaged German fighters, such as the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190, with increasing ease, decimating their formations and diminishing their combat effectiveness. During the final phases of planning for the D-Day landings, a question was posed to the head of Allied tactical aviation. What measures are we going to implement to counter the German fighters? His confident response was that there would be no need for a significant German air presence over the landing beaches. In essence, his prediction proved correct, because German aircraft had been effectively neutralized by their enemy's relentless aerial assaults before the invasion even commenced. This situation was exacerbated by Germany's strategic shortcomings, most notably, their failure to develop a robust infrastructure for pilot training comparable to that of their adversaries. As a result, the German Luftwaffe was painfully short of seasoned, experienced airmen. By the time revolutionary aircraft such as the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, the Arado AR-234 jet-powered bomber, the Me-163 rocket interceptor, and the Dornier Do-335 Aero, recognized as the fastest piston-engine aircraft of the Second World War, became operational. It was already too late to significantly alter the course of the conflict on either front. These technological marvels, which could potentially have changed the outcome of battles, arrived just as the tides of war were turning definitively against Germany, epitomizing the situation of too little, too late. The ultimate defeat of the German Luftwaffe can largely be attributed to a fundamental lack of strategic vision and direction. With the war increasingly turning against them, Adolf Hitler, Hermann Göring, and Ernst Udet operated under a false optimism that overshadowed reality. Initially, the Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine emphasized agility, close-range dogfighting, and tactical air support. However, as the conflict prolonged, this approach was gradually replaced by a protracted strategic bombing campaign that the German command was ill-equipped to sustain effectively. Their hubris extended to underestimating the industrial prowess of the United States and the Soviet Union, critical factors that they dismissed with arrogance. Meanwhile, a series of mismanagement failures ravaged their domestic aircraft industry. Resources were poorly allocated, production infrastructure was inadequate, and training programs remained underdeveloped throughout the war's most decisive years. These systemic issues ultimately led to the Luftwaffe's downfall, writing its own tragic epitaph in the history of aerial warfare. Turning attention to one of Germany's most impressive aircraft designs, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. In my opinion, it stands as the most formidable fighter aircraft of World War II. When engineers and designers created this revolutionary plane, they had the advantage of access to advanced wind tunnel testing facilities capable of simulating supersonic airflow, an element clearly reflected in the aircraft's streamlined fuselage. Moreover, they understood the benefits of swept-wing design, which eased the transition through transonic speeds and improved aerodynamic performance. The Me-262 262 was conceived with these modern principles in mind. It was truly ahead of its time, representing a significant leap forward in aviation technology. Upon first seeing the aircraft, I immediately recognized its distinct and innovative outline, markedly different from anything that had come before. However, at that moment, I had not yet fully grasped the profound impact its engines would have on aerial combat. In the early stages of jet propulsion development in Britain, our engines predominantly relied on centrifugally compressed turbines. The Germans, meanwhile, had initiated work on axial flow jet engines, a more efficient design that eventually became the standard in jet engines worldwide. Today, the axial flow configuration is the dominant technology in jet propulsion, indicating that the Germans were, from the outset, on the right technological track. Having said that, I must clarify that during the early years of jet engine development, axial flow engines were not yet the standard, and the Germans' approach was still in its developmental phase. I worked closely with Sir Frank Whittle, the British engineer who invented and developed the jet engine. I knew well that he was deeply familiar with axial flow designs and their immense potential. His pioneering work eventually paved the way for the vast advances in jet propulsion that have revolutionized aerial combat and transportation ever since. I once asked Frank why we had chosen to pursue the centrifugal jet engine technology when the Germans were predominantly developing axial flow engines. His response was that, during the initial stages of jet propulsion development, our priority was to provide the Air Force with an engine that was both simple and dependable. He explained that at that time, the German jet engines were still in their early phases of development, and as a result, their reliability was limited. Meanwhile, the centrifugal engines developed by Sir Frank Whittle, for example, had an overhaul life of approximately 100 hours, meaning they could operate effectively for that duration before requiring maintenance. In contrast, the German axial flow jet engines at that time had a much shorter operational life, roughly 25 hours, mainly because they lacked access to the strategic metals necessary to cope with the extreme heat stresses involved in jet engine operation. This technological choice, therefore, was initially justified. In the beginning, relying on the centrifugal engine proved to be the correct approach because it provided a more reliable and manageable power plant for the fledgling jet aircraft. Nonetheless, as technological progress advanced, the advantages of the axial flow configuration became increasingly evident. Axial engines offered significant benefits in terms of aerodynamics and streamlining. For a given power output, they required smaller compressor and turbine disks, which contributed to a more compact and efficient design. Additionally, axial engines demonstrated better specific fuel consumption, making them more economical in potential long-term use. Overall, it was a clearly superior technology in some key aspects, and they were indeed on the right track toward functionality and efficiency. However, they ultimately faced insurmountable limitations, largely because of the lack of strategic materials required for further advancements. As I mentioned earlier, they simply could not push their technology to the ultimate levels needed for broader strategic applications, mainly due to the unavailability of the right alloys capable of withstanding higher temperatures and stresses. Turning to the aircraft itself, flying this plane was an electrifying experience, particularly inside the cockpit. Despite the thrill, there was nothing unusually complicated about the design. It was quite straightforward and uncluttered. The cockpit was arranged with practicality in mind, featuring the essential controls and instruments clearly laid out. The engine gauges were positioned on the right side, and overall, it offered a good, unobstructed view through the canopy. Thanks to the tricycle landing gear configuration, pilots had excellent visibility ahead, enhancing safety and confidence during flight. Furthermore, the aircraft had numerous promising features that contributed to its appeal. Its layout and design elements provided many advantages, making it quite a promising platform for combat and maneuverability. Nonetheless, this optimistic picture was marred by the persistent unreliability of the engines. Even when the aircraft remained airborne, the engines proved highly sensitive to throttle adjustments. Excessive movement, either increasing or decreasing power, could cause the engines to flame out unexpectedly. The situation became so precarious that German pilots often adopted a risky procedure. They would take off at maximum power, then gradually reduce to climbing power, and once stabilized, avoid touching the throttle again until approaching the landing. This cautious practice was driven by a desire to prevent engine flameouts, which could be catastrophic. This approach, however, did not fully mitigate the problem. The engine life was theoretically around 25 hours, but as Adolf Galland shared with me near the end of the war, his unit flying the Messerschmitt Me-262 in the JG-44 Squadron was experiencing an average engine life of only about 12.5 hours. This discrepancy highlights the severe vulnerability of the aircraft's power plants and, consequently, their overall combat effectiveness. The limited durability of the engines meant frequent and costly repairs, diminishing operational readiness and emphasizing the machine's fragility in combat situations. In terms of firepower, the aircraft was formidable, equipped with an impressive array of weaponry, most notably for large 30mm caliber cannons. Its armament was designed to deliver devastating strikes against enemy targets. However, one critical oversight during its development was the failure to incorporate effective dive brakes. Like many other early jet aircraft, they had forgotten how important it was to have mechanisms enabling rapid deceleration during dives. This omission proved costly because the aircraft was primarily intended to engage B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, attacking them during steep dives. When diving on fast-moving targets at high closing speeds, often exceeding 600 yards, the pilot would need to fire accurately, but the absence of dive brakes meant she or he could not slow down quickly enough. This limitation meant that, upon entering a dive, the closing speed would be enormous, making precise shooting difficult. Typically, pilots would open fire from a distance of around 600 yards and then have mere 2 seconds before needing to break off the attack to avoid exposing themselves to enemy fire or losing control of the aircraft. Had the aircraft been equipped with proper dive brakes, the pilot could have slowed the approach, effectively doubling the time available to aim and fire accurately. Without this capability, fire was often wild and imprecise, relying on chance rather than accuracy, which significantly reduced the combat effectiveness of the aircraft's formidable armament. With only a mere 4 seconds to make a precise sight adjustment, you could then take your shot with remarkable speed and accuracy, which had a significant impact on combat effectiveness. Reflecting on this, I've come to believe that the Messerschmitt Me-262 was, in my opinion, a sentiment I have expressed numerous times, the most formidable aircraft developed after the conclusion of the Second World War. To put this into perspective, at the war's end, the most advanced Allied fighter was the Supermarine Spitfire Mark 14, which achieved a top speed of approximately 446 miles per hour. In stark contrast, when we put the Me-262 through testing, it reached an impressive maximum velocity of 568 miles per hour. Such a performance represented a true quantum leap, a significant breakthrough in aircraft technology and capabilities, making the Me-262 virtually invulnerable in combat. Its handling qualities in flight were also quite commendable. It didn't possess any particularly dangerous or uncontrollable traits, aside from a notable exception. If an engine failed during takeoff before reaching safe flying speed, it could pose a serious danger. But apart from this potential hazard, I was genuinely impressed by its overall design and performance. However, like many early jet aircraft from both Germany and America, the Me-262 had a couple of notable shortcomings. For starters, its engines were highly sensitive. They responded slowly to throttle commands, requiring pilots to handle the controls with great care to avoid causing a flameout, an engine cutout due to fuel or air mixture issues. The second problem was related to the aircraft's inability to decelerate quickly. In those days, designers hadn't yet developed effective air brakes for such high-speed planes, which meant slowing down the aircraft during landing was a real challenge. Since the Me-262 generated minimal drag at high speeds, completing a safe, controlled approach for landing necessitated a very long, slow descent, a process that was both time-consuming and risky. This lack of effective deceleration capability became a critical vulnerability, or an Achilles heel, recognized by its operators, who had to adapt their tactics accordingly. Despite these issues, the aircraft's overall performance left a very favorable impression. When considering the most notable German aircraft produced during the war, I would identify three as particularly outstanding: the Junkers Ju-88, the Focke-Wulf Fw-190, and the Messerschmitt Me 262. Among these, I believe the Ju-88 was an exceptional medium bomber. For example, the Ju-88 G4 variant could reach a top speed of around 400 miles per hour, which was about 6 miles per hour faster than the contemporary Focke-Wulf Fw-190A4, at the same time representing a formidable adversary. The Germans' experience with earlier designs, like the Henschel H-11, had taught them valuable lessons, particularly the importance of efficient crew arrangements. In the H-11, the crew was split up. The pilot and flight crew were positioned at the front, while the defensive personnel sat towards the back of the aircraft. Such a separation could lead to communication breakdowns and even affect morale among the crew members. Learning from these mistakes, the Germans decided to house the four-man crew of the Ju-88 inside a unified cockpit section, often referred to as a glass house, located along the fuselage. This design fostered better communication and crew cohesion, which earned widespread enthusiasm from the crews themselves, many of whom flew the aircraft frequently. In addition to the Ju-88, the German engineers developed the Fw-188 as well, which demonstrated somewhat different flying characteristics, particularly in its rudder response. Its handling qualities were slightly improved over those of the Ju-88, although this difference was minor and perhaps negligible in practical terms. Both aircraft retained the excellent flight characteristics typical of their class, with the Fw-188 slightly excelling in maneuverability and stability. I found myself very impressed with the performance of both types during my time flying them. Turning to the Focke-Wulf Fw-190, regarded primarily as a fighter aircraft, there can be no doubt that it was a first-class machine. Its performance and agility made it an outstanding fighter of its era. As the war advanced, the Germans continuously sought to enhance the aircraft's capabilities, offering a range of different versions and modifications to keep it competitive in the increasingly difficult air battles. Many variants of the Fw-190 were produced, each with incremental improvements, and over time, the aircraft gradually transitioned into a fighter-bomber role, which proved quite effective in combat. This adaptability in the aircraft's inherent capabilities underscored its importance and effectiveness during the war period. Fighter bombers played a rather specialized and limited role within the broader scope of aerial combat operations. Their primary function was not to engage in heavy bombing missions against large, fixed targets like industrial complexes or major strategic infrastructure. Instead, these aircraft were typically employed for more opportunistic strikes, targeting moving or vulnerable targets such as trains or convoys traveling along roads. Their agility and speed made them particularly effective for these swift, targeted attacks. The Focke-Wulf Fw-190, for instance, proved to be especially versatile and effective in this role, demonstrating its adaptability and reliability over the course of the conflict. This aircraft's design and capabilities allowed it to serve in various operational capacities as the war advanced. During its development, the Focke-Wulf Fw-190 underwent significant modifications, including an engine replacement, which marked a crucial evolution in its performance. The later version, known as the Dora, retained most of its original structural elements, but incorporated a more powerful engine. This upgrade was instrumental in ensuring the aircraft could remain competitive as a contemporary fighter, capable of keeping pace with emerging threats and other aircraft types that appeared as the war progressed. Indeed, from 1942 right up to the conclusion of hostilities, the Focke-Wulf Fw-190 remained among the top-tier fighters or fighter aircraft models used by the Allies and Axis alike, testifying to its enduring effectiveness and significance during this period. Following this overview, subsequent footage and documentation focus on the development and testing phases of the Messerschmitt Me 163B, a pioneering rocket-powered fighter aircraft. The B model represented the culmination of the Me 163 line, serving as the ultimate and most advanced version designed for combat roles. While the majority of flights involving the Me 163B were conducted for development and testing purposes, This aircraft did eventually participate in limited combat operations starting around mid-Enus 1944. Observing the physical differences between the Me-163B and its earlier counterpart, the A model, one notes notable distinctions in shape and structural robustness. The landing gear on the B model was considerably sturdier than that employed by the earlier version. We can see ground crew members carefully handling the jettisonable takeoff gear, maneuvering it into position before flight, alongside the extending landing gear, which was an important feature of this aircraft. The design of the Me-163B was significantly larger compared to the initial A model, which was so compact that a pilot could easily just slide over the side of the canopy sill to exit the aircraft, an impractical arrangement for operational use. The B model, on the other hand, required the use of a ladder to access the cockpit comfortably and safely. As the canopy was closed, a small air vent became visible at the leading edge, indicating considerations for pilot comfort and aircraft functionality. An important structural distinction was the hinge mechanism. The B model's canopy was hinged on the side, unlike the rear-hinged canopy of the A model, improving access and possibly visibility. One critical component that necessitated regular servicing was the turbine engine housed within the Me-163B, which drove fuel pumps essential for both the liquid propellants and the rocket motor's operation. The servicing process involved rolling away a specialized cart designed for turbines, which facilitated maintenance and refueling operations. Viewers can also glimpse the retractable tail wheel at the rear of the aircraft, a feature that replaced the earlier tail skid found on the A model. Early B model variants featured an unfaired tail wheel, which was later upgraded in some aircraft to include a streamlined fairing design to reduce aerodynamic drag and improve overall flight efficiency. Consistent with its lineage, the Me-163B maintained exceptional climb performance. Its capability to ascend swiftly from a standstill to approximately 40,000 feet in roughly 3 to 3.5 minutes remained outstanding and demonstrated the aircraft's strategic advantage in rapid interference and interception scenarios. However, this impressive performance came with significant operational limitations. Preparing and launching an Me-163B was a lengthy and complex process, unlike conventional combat aircraft used by the Luftwaffe, such as the Focke-Wulf FW-190 or the Messerschmitt Bf-109. Unlike these aircraft, which could be scrambled quickly to respond to threats, the rocket-powered Me-163B required extensive pre-flight preparations, making it less suitable for rapid response to oncoming enemy aircraft or Allied attacks. In essence, while the Me-163B was a remarkable piece of engineering, its operational use was constrained by its specialized design and demanding launch procedures, which distinguished it from the more standard, readily available fighter aircraft of the era. Once the aircraft halted on the airfield, the task of clearing and removing it proved to be a considerable logistical challenge. To accomplish this, engineers developed a specialized device, though its German name is quite complex to pronounce, and I will refrain from attempting it here. This device worked by employing large airbags positioned beneath the wings of the aircraft. These airbags could be inflated to generate enough lifting force, subtly raising the aircraft off the ground and facilitating its transportation away from the runway or field. Such a method was quite innovative at the time and allowed for easier handling of heavy or damaged aircraft after landing. Later, this initial system was superseded by an improved device that replaced the inflatable airbags with rigid arms, offering more stability and control during the aircraft's transfer. In some frontal photographs of an Me-163B, several notable features stand out clearly. One prominent element is the propeller located at the very nose of the aircraft. This propeller was not just for propulsion but served an additional purpose. It drove a small electrical generator. The generator's role was to supply power to onboard instrumentation and communication radios, which were vital for navigation and operational communication during flights. Just above the well designed for the landing skid, a small circular hole can be seen. This was intended for attaching a tow line, a cable used during towing or ground handling to maneuver the aircraft safely. Most flights of the Me-163 series, especially during the early stages of operation, involved unpowered glide descents, where aircraft were towed aloft by a separate aircraft, often a German Messerschmitt Bf 110. These glides were essential to conserve fuel and maximize the rocket engine's limited operational life. The landings with the comet-shaped Me-163 often faced technical issues, particularly with the landing skid. This component was extended hydraulically before landing, but the hydraulic system itself was prone to failure. Such failures could sometimes result in difficult or problematic landings, which were a common concern in operational usage. The subsequent series of photographs offers us detailed views of the aircraft's intricate features. One such feature is a partially extended wing flap located underneath the wing surface. This flap was mounted directly onto the wing's surface rather than being recessed or flush with it, highlighting a distinctive design choice. Additionally, a later version of the Me-163B can be seen with its tail wheel extended. Remarkably, this particular aircraft also has a fairing installed over the tail wheel, indicating modifications made during its operational life to improve aerodynamics or protect components. Soon, more detailed shots will focus on the rear end of the aircraft. At this point, viewers can observe smoke still drifting from the nozzle of the Walter rocket engine, emphasizing that the rocket motor was still active or had recently been shut down. It is worth recalling that takeoff was especially challenging for pilots flying the Me-163, especially during the initial phases of the roll. The takeoff roll required a considerable runway length, but beyond that, maintaining directional stability during the very early phase of acceleration posed an additional obstacle. Before the rudder could become fully effective, pilots often struggled to keep the aircraft aligned on the runway. To mitigate this issue, a device known as the stroll rudder was developed and tested on both the A and B models. This device could be fitted into the rocket engine's exhaust and provided some additional directional control during the initial moments of takeoff, helping pilots to guide the aircraft more safely during what was known to be a difficult process. We then see an image of the aircraft transporter equipped with airbags, actively in use. This method of transportation allowed for safer and more efficient movement of the aircraft across various terrains or between different locations on the airfield. The following sequence of images is particularly captivating because it offers glimpses into the lives of some of the most influential figures involved with the Me-163 program. Among them is a woman named Hannah Reich, a prominent test pilot during Nazi Germany's tenure in aircraft development. She was known not only for her skills in flying experimental aircraft, but also for her personal connections, including being a friend of Adolf Hitler. Reich notably campaigned hard in hopes of being granted permission to fly the Me-163 herself, a risky endeavor given the aircraft's experimental nature and performance challenges. Standing tall in sunglasses and wearing a protective coat, the man next to her is Heinrich Dittmar, who was one of the early test pilots closely associated with the Me-163 program. His role was crucial in understanding the aircraft's handling characteristics and establishing flight protocols. We will revisit Hannah Reich's story in more detail shortly. Moving on, some footage captures testing of a rocket motor mounted on a Me-163. Notably, in this footage, a protective cover is placed on the rear edge of the aircraft's rudder, likely to prevent damage during engine testing or ground handling. These images serve as a testament to the intense technical scrutiny and development efforts invested in perfecting the aircraft's rocket propulsion system, which was a groundbreaking step in aviation history. In several of these footage frames, you can also observe several droplets of molten metal resembling tiny diamonds, shimmering in the exhaust plume of the rocket engine. This phenomenon vividly indicates the presence of supersonic airflow escaping from the engine exhaust, emphasizing the immense speed and power involved. Moving on, we see in Me-163B rocket-powered aircraft preparing for takeoff from a smooth, paved runway. This controlled environment clearly provided a significantly more comfortable and safer experience for the pilots compared to attempting a takeoff from a rough, unpaved airfield, which would have posed far greater risks. Further, as the program progressed, there was a notable improvement concerning the landing gear technology. The initial designs used on the early versions, both the A and B models, were rigid structures lacking any form of suspension capability. This rigidity made the takeoff process particularly strenuous, not only challenging for the pilots due to the rough ride, but also placing considerable stress on the aircraft structure itself. Recognizing this issue, engineers eventually incorporated shock-absorbing mechanisms into the landing gear. These enhancements served to cushion the impact during takeoff and landing, thereby safeguarding the pilots from excessive jolts and reducing structural fatigue on the aircraft. In another scene, a fully equipped Mi-163B is seen being towed behind a larger aircraft, specifically in Mi-110. This method of transportation was a common practice for training and operational preparation, as most of the flight testing and pilot training for the rocket aircraft did not involve actual powered flight immediately. Instead, pilots performed numerous towed flights, which allowed them to become familiar with aircraft handling and control characteristics safely. Turning back to the story of Hannah Reich, a pioneering woman who was deeply committed to flying the Mi-163. She had actively lobbied for the chance to fly this advanced aircraft, demonstrating considerable determination and confidence in her abilities. Ultimately, she managed to pilot the aircraft on 5 separate occasions. During her final flight, however, a malfunction occurred when the takeoff undercarriage failed to release promptly after liftoff. This mechanical failure compelled her to abort the mission and return to the airfield, resulting in a notably rough and jarring landing. Her injuries from this incident were severe enough to keep her out of the cockpit for the following 5 months, and unfortunately, she never had another opportunity to fly the Comet again. Moving on, the subsequent footage features another individual who played a crucial role in the development and testing of the aircraft, the engineer and test pilot Rudy Opitz. Like Rakhan Dipmar, Opitz was an experienced glider pilot, a background that proved invaluable for working with the rocket plane. His expertise in silent, unpowered flight helped him better understand the handling characteristics of this complex aircraft. In one of these shots, he is shown boarding in Mi-163B, preparing for a test flight. You can see a machine gun protruding from the leading edge of the wing, which was part of the aircraft's armament to provide defensive capabilities during combat missions. Additionally, many images showcase a notably thick piece of armored glass installed directly in front of the pilot's cockpit. This was an essential feature for aircraft intended for combat, designed to withstand and deflect enemy fire. Alongside this reinforced glass, an armored nose cone was also installed, providing protection for the pilot during head-on attacks or high-speed approaches toward enemy formations, especially as this aircraft often flew straight into the face of advancing Allied forces during its operational period. Most likely, these scenes depict yet another test flight of the Comet, aimed at gathering vital operational data. Notably, Opitz appears with a large, spring-driven camera mounted on his headgear in several shots. This device was employed to take photographs of the aircraft's instrument panel at critical moments during the flight. It was a crucial tool for engineers to analyze performance and diagnose issues. Compared to today's highly advanced digital data acquisition systems, this equipment seems primitive but effective for its time. At the same time, it stands in stark contrast to the crude analog instrumentation used during the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s and 60s, highlighting the technological evolution in aircraft data collection over the decades.